But today's going to be a fascinating discussion on health and nutrition. I'm bringing together two folks I've gotten to know. One is Tucker Goodrich, who you hear him weekly on my radio program and some of our deep dive nutrition discussions. He's been a nutritional researcher, an independent thinker on the question of the dietary guidelines, particularly related to the consumption of vegetable oils, seed oils, as we call them. We also joined by Georgi Dinkov, who is returning. We've had him on recently with Brad Marshall, and he comes from a bioenergetic approach to health and nutrition, also critical of PUFA, and someone who has worked and studied under Ray Peat's ideas. So welcome, folks. Georgi and Tucker, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you, David. As always, it's a pleasure to be here again. Georgi, nice to make your acquaintance.
Likewise.
Well, very good. So, Tucker, now you come to the table from kind of a paleo perspective, a low-carb perspective, and Georgi, you come from a perspective with kind of a Ray Peat style bioenergetic approach, which is going to be more pro-sugar, but there's a lot of overlap on that even, I think, between the two of you. But first, I wanted to give you guys an opportunity to kind of introduce how you first came across the problem of PUFA and seed oils as such a big part of what's wrong with our health in America.
Well, even more than that, we both come from an IT and systems engineering background,
Yes,
it sounds
that's
like.
correct. Yes.
So
yes, exactly.
that gives us a leg up in thinking about these things as we've been face to face with brutal logic for a good part of our careers. And even if you don't want it to, it can't help but influence your thinking.
Yeah, I agree. The systemic approach, and also like if things don't make sense, in the computer world, that things will invariably break down the line. So there's no way to politically weasel your way out of a dangerous situation. And it seems to be the same way in health. So as I've found the hard way. By the way, I also used to be in the paleo world, and that's actually what first got me into the health sphere, and then I discovered Ray Peat. So I guess I share with Tucker a background in paleo and low carb as well. But it really is an interest, away from the vegetable world and more towards the animal in terms of using it as food.
Yep. Okay, cool. So I got into this not because I had any desire to. I had gotten quite sick, and we won't go into that now because I've described it before in countless other podcasts, including with David. But I was convinced to one day to try, as my first intervention, cutting out seed oils. And I discovered that my health rapidly improved, and I rapidly started losing weight, and my skin improved. Pretty much everything got better. In the process of that, I discovered that I had a severe gluten intolerance, which has also been a significant impact on my diet ever since. So those two factors combined, and I could, as I played around with it over time, adding variables back in and seeing what the effect was, I discovered that most of my symptoms were attributable to one or the other of those two factors. And I was able to fix all of my health issues, fire my very expensive concierge doctor, and, just kind of be free to enjoy life and spread the good news of what you can do to your health with diet. And, I never had an interest in it before. I thought it was kind of BS. I had a mother growing up who was on Weight Watchers and had the typical Weight Watchers roller coaster. And, so I thought diet, quote, was BS, and figured that if I just roughly followed the dietary guidelines, I'd probably be okay. And of course, it wasn't until I turned those upside down that I was actually able to fix my health.
Yeah, similar story here. I also got into it not because I wanted to, even though my interest in biochemistry was kind of developed organically along with the interest my profession in IT. When I first got out of college in 2002, 2003 timeframe, was right after the dot-com crash. And with my degree in computer science and math, nobody wanted to touch people like me with a 10-foot pole in terms of employment. So I was forced to take up a job as a sort of bioinformatics research analyst, really a programmer, for a outfit here that was renting space from my alma mater, Georgetown University, and that outfit was called the National Biomedical Research Foundation. And they were basically had a huge grant from the government to develop a protein database called UniProt. Uniprot.org is the website. And that was my work. I built most of that website together with 2 other people. And between 2002 and 2005, it was us 2 or 3 IT guys building something, but really working hand in hand with about 40 to 50 of the most renowned biochemists and protein specialists and even doctors, most of them holding joint positions at the NCBI Center up at the National Institutes of Health and various positions as professors at universities throughout the country. So, I work with those people. And since the whole environment was about biochemistry and medicine, me with my IT background, I could not really fit in unless I started, unless I learned their lingo, so to speak. And, I asked them what I can do to get some knowledge of their area. And they said, look, if you're only doing it for knowledge and not for degree, read these 2 or 3 books, start coming to our lectures. And over the course of 3 years of working with them, I kind of acquired enough of a working knowledge to at least understand or begin to understand what they're talking about. And then since then, I got after I left, I got a job in IT security, but that stayed as a hobby. Basically, I didn't want to lose those 3 years that I've dedicated to learning biochemistry and physiology. So I kept reading up, basically studies on PubMed. And around 2008, 2009, got into the paleo world before paleo was even hitting the mainstream. Unfortunately, the extreme low carb diet that my doctor, whom subsequently I also fired, he basically said, yeah, paleo is good, but you need to go really low carb. So he basically had me eliminate all carbs to the point of me getting almost into ketosis. And my health started really suffering, as I explained on the first podcast with David. And then around 2011, 2012, just by searching randomly for aspirin and inflammation, I stumbled upon Dr. Peat's website, started reading that, and basically he has a number of articles on the dangers of all polyunsaturated fats, regardless of their origin. And since most of Eastern Europe is really a conspiratorial mindset, I kind of did a little bit of fact checking on a lot of the things that Dr. Peat writes about. And the one graph that still sticks to me, and to me is one of the best explanations of the dangers of the seed oils, is if you look at the ratio of seed oils in terms of their percentage of the diet of the American population, starting from around the 1920s to today, basically the rise in the percentage of seed oil consumption as part of the diet mimics almost perfectly the obesity and the diabetes curve that is basically besetting the U.S. and actually all Western or quote unquote developed countries populations. I also looked at the so-called twin studies, and there are quite a few studies that show that, let's say, like identical twins from Okinawa get separated, and basically like one girl goes to the U.S. or somewhere in Western Europe, the other one stays in Okinawa. Within 10 years, the person, the twin, the identical twin, genetically identical to the other one that goes to the Western society, has the same higher risk of all kinds of cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementias, et cetera, while the twin that stays in Okinawa is not like that. And there's, of course, there could be many explanations, but the one explanation that does not fly is that it's all genetic, right? And then if you really start digging in and kind of look at the data, you'll see that the seed oils are everywhere. They're heavily promoted. They're extremely profitable to the industry. And once the conspiratorial mindset kicks in, then you start finding evidence everywhere. Doesn't mean that it's all real and legit, but there's very little that can be offered as an argument against the really proven fact at this point is that the PUFAs are the darling of the agriculture industry in terms of making profit, and they're ubiquitous in virtually all commercial / processed foods. Yet other animal fats that are mostly saturated are really not, and in fact they're much more expensive, but also much more expensive to produce / source. So what does the industry do? Big agriculture, as they call it. Well, they're going to push the PUFA. And you can look at the fast food businesses too. McDonald's, KFC, Burger King. They used to fry their fries in I think like
tallow.
Beef. Yeah, beef tallow, exactly, or butter. Yeah. Exactly. And that was all scrap. Well, why would a large corporation like that do away with these oils? It wasn't because at the time, I mean, the campaign against saturated fat hadn't really started yet. That started in the 70s.
No. For McDonald's, it was specifically because of the alleged
health
benefits of polyunsaturated fats. Yeah, it was the Center for Science and the Public Interest started making a big deal about how they were killing everybody with beef tallow.
Right, but it also coincided nicely with the fact that the PUFAs were also a lot more profitable for McDonald's.
Well, they're much cheaper than beef tallow. Yeah,
exactly.
If you can lower your cost of a major ingredient like that, then that drops straight to the bottom line. So yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's really how it played out for me. After you start really looking into things, you start seeing a lot of things that you were oblivious to before, simply because you had no reason to search for those things. But once you're pressed, in my case, due to a health reason, just I guess as you, the evidence is everywhere. Now, of course, you have to be careful not to get carried away, because some things are sort of like both sides can do hit pieces on each other. Throw stuff out there that it's all outlandish, that it's really it needs to be looked at with a critical eye. But if you look at the biochemistry of the seed oils, specifically the polyunsaturated fats, and how they affect the mammalian organism and their hormonal / endocrine effects, whatever little doubt remains that they may be helpful usually dissipates, simply because so many of their effects overlap with estrogen, which is now known as the NIH actually declared estrogen as a known human carcinogen back in 2002. Not many people know that, but it's still on the NIH website. So if these seed oils have the same effects as estrogen biochemically, and are also the precursors to most of the inflammatory mediators, such as the prostaglandins and the leukotrienes, then you have even more solid evidence that consuming these oils is probably not good for your health.
Probably not good for your health. That's a good way to put it.
Georgi, one of the things that the Ray Peat crowd talks about also is endotoxin. Is that just as important in causing health defects as the seed oils and PUFA accumulation in the body, or are they the same? Is it a downstream effect or what? How does that work out?
Well, they actually synergize. There's a compound produced in our body called lipofuscin, and it's actually a combination of iron and peroxidized polyunsaturated fats. So without PUFA, you don't get lipofuscin. And lipofuscin has been known to accumulate in every cell, in every organ, in every tissue in the body. And its accumulation, and the cell cannot really get rid of it very easily. So its accumulation actually eventually starts to damage the mitochondria and our ability to produce energy. There are several companies out there that have been given a lot of money trying to reverse that process of lipofuscin accumulation. But how about prevent it altogether? And the one way you can do it is by avoiding eating easily peroxidizable fats, which are all of the PUFAs. Saturated fat does not produce lipofuscin. In fact, there is some evidence that saturated compounds such as the tocopherols, especially when combined with saturated fats, may be able to actually dissolve the lipofuscin and get it out of the cell. But in terms of inflammation, the PUFA increases the permeability of the gut barrier, so you actually absorb more endotoxin from the gastrointestinal tract, where it's always produced, because we have this microbiome. And whenever you get some undigested food that reaches the colon, the bacteria there starts to eat it, and this increases the turnover of the bacteria. And as the older bacteria, or so to speak, the older bacteria dies off, they rupture, and the gram-negative bacteria, they have as part of their shell this compound called lipopolysaccharide, or also endotoxin. And it's highly inflammatory. It has a special receptor that it activates in the body called the toll-like receptor 4, TLR4. And basically the activation of that receptor triggers an inflammatory cascade, which involves the increase of the synthesis of serotonin, of nitric oxide, of the prostaglandins, which are of course synthesized from PUFA. And basically over time, this inflammatory cascade, if it affects the peripheral organs and tissues, leads to all kinds of degenerative diseases, such as fibrotic conditions, especially of the liver. People with chronic endotoxemia have an abnormally higher rate of liver cirrhosis and liver failure and liver cancer. But even beyond that, now there are several studies that have come out that said Alzheimer's disease is actually, if not directly caused, then the endotoxin / lipofuscin, lipopolysaccharide is a major player in the actual pathology of Alzheimer's disease. So the beta amyloid protein that we see accumulating in brains of people with Alzheimer's may actually be a defensive mechanism against this presence of endotoxin in the bloodstream. And also the PUFA, just as they increase the permeability of the gut barrier, they also increase the permeability of the blood-brain barrier. So whatever endotoxin is in your blood is going to have easier time getting to your brain and triggering the same inflammatory cascade as it does everywhere else. So PUFA, basically PUFA and endotoxin work together to create a state of chronic inflammation, which either one of them on its own is probably not going to be able to do as much damage as the two of them combined. But they really sort of support each other. Like if you eat more PUFA, you're going to get more, endotoxin into your bloodstream. But then there's also this endotoxin triggers the synthesis of more inflammatory mediators, which are using PUFA as a source. So having these two together is, is a really sort of like a good way to ensure that you end up with some very severe, severe chronic degenerative disease, usually cancer, definitely cardiovascular disease, which at this point modern medicine has kind of given up. So said, well, everybody will get diabetes and cardiovascular disease by the time they're 50. So they've anything but said that. I mean, 30% of the U.S. population is pre-diabetic, and diabetes type 2, and in general, the
total number of diabetic plus pre-diabetic is over 50% now.
Over 50%, exactly. And you can safely assume that anybody with an insulin resistance / metabolic syndrome / pre-diabetes / diabetes type 2 will have some sort of stage of cardiovascular disease. And eventually that ends up as either heart attack, ischemic heart attack or ischemic stroke. In a small percentage could be hemorrhaging as well. Either way, this chronic inflammation wreaks havoc on the cardiovascular system. And then over time, even if those two events don't kill you in your 50s, usually in your 50s and 60s, but now we're seeing much younger people come down with strokes. Justin Bieber's wife had stroke at 28. He got facial paralysis, and even though he's saying that it was due to some kind of a viral infection, now information is starting to leak out that he may have had a stroke as well. Just the paralysis of the face, just the hemiparalysis is such a classic symptom of stroke that it's very hard to excuse with a viral infection. Viral infection is usually indiscriminate.
I walked into my office once and my colleague had that, and it was Bell's palsy, and it was caused by a viral infection. So it can also be caused by a stroke, and he went promptly to the emergency room because of that possibility, but it turned out to just be a harmless infection. So that's possible in Justin Bieber's case, who I know almost nothing about. Then he's apparently famous.
Well, but in his wife's case, and she's younger than him, it was actually stroke. So anyways, the bottom line is that with these conditions that are now affecting 50% of the population, we're looking at a medical nightmare over the next decade or so, unless something drastically changes. But as far as looking for the causes, such as, I said, okay, just as in the case of lipofuscin, why worry about removing it instead of starting to worry about not getting it there to start with? Okay, well, what can you do about cardiovascular disease and cancer and all these kind of things? Well, if you look at the older studies, they make no secret about the fact that seed oils, and specifically the omega-6 fatty acids, are intimately involved in all of these conditions. Older studies with vitamin E showed complete prevention of cardiovascular disease by feeding them, the rats, mice, rabbits, even monkeys and pigs.
Not that didn't translate into humans.
That's what I'm saying. So, but then subsequent studies with humans said, well, we didn't see the same results. However, one study with nurses did show 42% reduction in basically cardiovascular disease over a 10-year period. Now, there's been some concern whether the human studies used the exact same type of vitamin E as that one that was used in the older studies. The older studies used the mixed tocopherols, usually extracted from wheat germ oil, right? And out of that, in addition to vitamin E, they have a lot of other chemicals, including the very long chain saturated fatty acid alcohols known as polycosanol. Those have separate studies on them. Unfortunately, mostly coming out of Cuba, and that research has been sort of like denigrated, said, oh, it's commie science, right? But anyways, the older studies with vitamin E, it's hard to compare them to the newer ones with vitamin E because almost all the new ones with vitamin E are using the isolated one of the tocopherol isomers, usually the alpha tocopherol, but not the alpha tocopherol, but it's usually either DL alpha tocopheryl, so it has the two isomers, one of them considered inactive, or an ester such as alpha tocopheryl acetate. or alpha tocopherol palmitate. And so the newer studies, I cannot argue with this, they did not see the same benefits in humans as the animal studies done before the 1950s did, right? I've asked Dr. Peat about that, and his response is that you can't really compare them because they didn't use the same compounds.
Well,
into the studies.
they also discovered a mechanism for that, right? That tocopherols can act as pro-oxidants of omega-6 fats. So even when you're looking at people who aren't supplementing, they did a study on doctors on this. Yeah, the tocopherols act as pro-oxidants of omega-6 fats. So not even looking at a supplementation study, they looked at physicians, who are always good guinea pigs for a study like these, just because they're willing. And the physicians with higher levels of tocopherols had higher rates of cardiovascular disease. And what they're thinking is that it acts as a pro-oxidant. It stimulates the disease process, right? Which would explain why the supplementation backfires. The same thing is true of vitamin C, which works well in a lot of in vitro studies. It's an antioxidant. However, if you take vitamin C with iron, which is how we eat it, right, then it's a pro-oxidant, and it's used to stimulate oxidative stress in vivo.
Yeah, and of course, the vitamin C increases the absorption of iron. And now there are several studies saying that with age, we tend to accumulate iron at the expense of copper and zinc. And since the lipofuscin is also composed, part of it is iron, they're saying, well, maybe it's the chronic overaccumulation of iron at the expense of other minerals that also plays a role in cardiovascular disease. And they have several animal studies that kind of give a little bit corroboration of that, is that iron chelators, such as desferoxamine, were found to basically be able to stop several types of cancer, and they were able to prevent the animal model of Alzheimer's dementia and Parkinson's disease. So there is something to be said, I guess, about also the accumulation of the heavy metal iron, which is crucial for the production of hemoglobin and carrying oxygen, but it can very easily go into a situation where you have too much of it. And then it becomes a pro-oxidant and starts destroying the polyunsaturated fats in your organism.
I mean, iron's, I've looked into iron a lot. Iron doesn't appear to be a problem at all, unless you have a genetic inability to properly process it, or you're eating a high polyunsaturated fat diet, because iron catalyzes PUFA oxidation. Yep. So, I've looked at studies looking at colon cancer where heme iron is a major player, and they literally, they take out the polyunsaturated fat water from the colon and remove the iron, and that leads to colon cancer, whereas the heme iron alone doesn't. So that's another, iron's another confounder that I've looked into a lot, because so many people are like, oh, too much, red meat, iron's going to kill you. And it's like, no, not if you're on a natural diet. I mean,
yeah, and also red meat's got other things to balance the iron, so it's really like iron. I don't
think the iron on its own is a problem at all. I mean, there are populations who have 6 times the iron content, like the Bantu, and there's no evidence of toxicity from that level of iron. So
I was going to mention the Maasai, who drink blood and eat mostly meat diet, and they seem to be doing perfectly fine.
Right. Well, the Bantu get it from cooking in iron pots and things all the time. So they're getting elemental iron, which one would imagine be worse than heme iron, which is at least packaged in a way that your body's expecting it. But still, there's no evidence of harm.
So we're back to PUFA as the causative, the one factor to unite them all.
So that's the thing that unites the conversation. But here's where I want to parse out how this works for solutions. And I think you guys probably agree on a lot of this too, but trying to figure this out.
I was going to say, David, if you're going to get us into a fight here, you're going to have to try harder.
I know, but the thing, so what I'm trying to figure out though, okay, is once I've got thousands of people understanding the seed oil thing, because I'm hitting a broadcast audience, FM, AM, people who never would ever look up a keto podcast or a Ray Peat podcast or anything. These are people in regular working class America, and they're now turning on to the seed oil thing. But I'm at an impasse because I don't want to just give them what not to do. I want to give them, when they ask me, well, what should I eat, and and Tucker, you tend to be more into the paleo world, but I mean, you're not super low carb, but you're not anti super low carb, I think.
Well, I've been keto. I had been keto for 10 plus years.
And what do you mean by keto? Like 20 carbs a day?
Most days, 0. I mean, I would eat carbs maybe once a week. So yeah, I was, on a keto diet for a long time.
And now you're not?
Now I'm not. I don't think there's a benefit or an evolutionary argument for being continuously in ketosis.
Yep.
I don't think there are any populations that ever were continually in ketosis. What I do think is necessary is being intermittently in ketosis, and we can discuss that, right? I think that's essential. I don't think, I mean, I personally still say on the low carb diet side of things because I feel best that way. But I don't think it's essential. I do think it's essential in the context of a high PUFA intake or when you're recovering from a high PUFA intake. And I guess that's one area where I differ from Dr. Peat and company. So maybe that's something we can get into.
Yeah. So how do we heal from a high PUFA toxicity state that most people are in? Do you go the high sugar route? Do you do the fruit juice, the milk like Ray Peat, or do you do a low carb thing? And we know remove PUFA. Of course, there's a debate about whether you remove the fish oils and the omega-3s as well, but let's just assume you just remove PUFA. Where do you go from there? Do you start upping your sugar?
I agree with Ray Peat about the fish oil thing. I think fish oil supplementation is a bad idea. We do need some level of omega-3 fats in the diet, and but what you get from eating pastured meat and occasionally eating fish is going to be more than sufficient to meet that need.
Yep, I agree. So as far as displacing PUFA, I mean, he has one famous article where he basically says that the turnover is about 4 years, the full turnover of the fat cells. So basically, you'll need like maybe 2 years to get properly depleted of the PUFAs, even if you consciously restrict them. I found some other studies showing that.
But that's only looking at one aspect of it, right?
Right. I think it can be done much more quickly. There was one study with monkeys showing that on a completely fat-free diet, they lost all of their tissue PUFAs in 30 days. Now, of course, I don't know. I think that's a bit extreme. Not many people are on a fat-free diet.
Where were they measuring tissue PUFA?
Oh, they were actually. I mean, I think they sacrificed the monkeys and they basically.
But what were they measuring? Every single tissue compartment in their bodies, or were they measuring serum? Or
I have to look at the. No, they were basically measuring some of the visceral fat and some of the subcutaneous. So they took from some of the extremities, from the liver, I think the spleen, and I think the brain, and some muscles. I have to look at the study, but I mean, even that study I find too extreme. I don't think it would be advisable for people to go on a fat-free diet. They've done
fat-free diets in rodents, and they don't lose all of it, right? I mean, in certain compartments, the body preserves PUFAs because it needs them, especially the brain and the heart. But yeah, I think a lot of it depends. A lot of it is going to depend on tissue turnover, right? There are tissues like the skin, for instance, that have a very high turnover. That's going to be replaced very quickly. Because as new cells are made, they're going to be made from dietary fats and fats released from adipose. But in other tissues, like, for instance, the heart or in cartilage that have a much longer turnover time, it's a big, I've never seen anybody look at I've seen, there's a study out there showing how fast omega-6 PUFA gets incorporated into cartilage, and it's in a couple of weeks. But I've never seen anything about how quickly it can be replaced from cartilage. And, adipose is just half-life, as far as I know, nobody's ever measured how long it actually takes to go out, but it takes, 680 days to get in. And every study I've ever seen references that Dayton study from the 1960s and says, oh, well, if it takes the half-life going in is 680 days, we'll just assume the half-life going out is 680 days. We don't know that that's true or not.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. Some studies use as a surrogate the production of mead acid in the blood.
Right.
They're saying that, you know, if your body senses that it is EFA deficient, essential fatty acid deficient, which is what they define most of the omega-6 to be, then it starts producing the omega-9 meat acid.
Right.
And then most of the animal studies that I've seen show that you need about a month of either replacing all of the fat with completely saturated fat. They usually do coconut oil, or you need to go on a completely fat-free diet for a rodent. Now, however, the lifespan of a rodent is about 2 years, let's say for a rat.
Right. Exactly.
A month for a rat is probably not the same as a month for a human. I mean, their tissue turnover is obviously much faster.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we know it's not. I think a month for a rat is equal to like 14 years for a human.
Yeah, and if that's the case, then that's bad news because, and I don't know of any studies that have looked at how quickly EFA can be induced in humans because it's considered unethical.
No,
to actually,
there actually are a lot of studies because they do it when they do total parenteral nutrition. Right, that's how it was discovered in humans originally. So
right, but it happens by accident. I don't know of any studies that purposefully did EFA by
they've intentionally done it because, for instance, there was one case where a kid was allergic to soybean, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the typical TPN solution is soybean oil. They couldn't feed it to the kid, so they had to put him on a fat-free solution, and he developed essential fatty acid deficiency. Now, as you note, they're measuring that by the presence of meat acid, and meat acid is a long-chain omega-9 fatty acid that's a replacement for arachidonic acid, right? So, you know, I know you know this. I'm saying this for the listeners. Arachidonic acid is mostly made, you either get it from eating meat or it's made from linoleic acid, which is the main omega-6 fat in seed oils. Meat acid is made from oleic acid, which the body can make itself, right? So the body can make as much meat acid as it needs. Now, they use this as an indicator. Once you get enough, once you get a low enough level of omega-6, your body starts making omega-9, and they claim that's the sign of essential fatty acid deficiency. I don't think it is. I actually think that a normal amount of some amount of meat acid is probably what we have evolved for. And the evidence in favor of that was a woman who was on a TPN solution and was not able to tolerate the fat infusion, so was on a fat-free diet through 2 pregnancies, right? So she brought to term 2 children who were perfectly healthy in an essential fatty acid deficient state, where I think around 15% of her serum fats were meat acid. So she was about as essential, quote unquote, again, essential fatty acid deficient as it's possible for a human to be. Now, the definition of essentiality is that you can't live and reproduce without it, right? So here we have a case in a human where she did, and she produced healthy offspring without it, right? So I think most likely we evolved to be in a state where we are, I'm not going to say deficient, but where we don't have much omega-6 and where we are producing this omega-9 fatty acids. And the signature thing about an omega-9 fatty acid is it's not as susceptible to oxidation as the omega-6 fatty acids, of course. So it's going to be much more protective against, all of the chronic diseases that we've been talking about.
And also the downstream mediators. So meat acid becomes a substrate for the cyclooxygenase and the lipoxygenase enzymes, but the derivatives of it produced by those enzymes are not inflammatory, unlike the actual prostaglandins and leukotrienes produced from arachidonic acid.
Right, and now that said, again, we need those for in a normal human diet. I like to say the only way you're going to get essential fatty acid deficiency is if you're a rat in a lab or you're under the care of a doctor, right?
Probably, yeah.
It's impossible to become deficient in omega-6 essential fatty acids in eating any sort of natural human diet, right? Yeah. Period, end of story. It's just impossible because every vegetable has it, every meat has it, even fish has some omega-6 fatty acid, so you're never going to become deficient. But
what about if you're drinking, say, fat-free milk with orange juice, and that's your diet.
Well, like I said, then you're under the well, yeah, but
I
nobody's
don't know who would come
suggesting
up with that, but I
nobody's-
mean, just in
but
case.
nobody's suggesting that you do that for the rest of your life, right? That's an intervention.
Right. So what is that? So, Georgie, why do you say that you don't recommend a fat-free intervention? What's the danger of that? You know, I mean,
So I found it very hard to stick to. We seem to have evolved with a certain taste for fats, and we know that they're necessary for the proper development of the brain and functioning of the brain, for proper reproductive function. The jury, I think, is still out on how well you can reproduce or at least develop viable sperm if you're on a completely fat-free diet. There's some animal studies suggesting that while your testosterone levels would likely increase a lot, the actual viability of the sperm will drop if you're on a completely fat-free diet. And I also personally, I've tried it. I couldn't do a month. I mean, I could do maybe 2 weeks on a completely fat-free diet.
Why were you trying it? Just to have fun, or was there a specific reason?
No, health reasons. Basically, I was having some very concerning symptoms that the doctor thought were potentially multiple sclerosis, but he sent me to 3 MRIs. All of them came back clear, and he basically said, I cannot officially diagnose you with MS because you don't have any lesions in your spinal cord in your brain. But he says the numbness, like the weakness in extremities that comes and goes away. This is classic MS, and he basically said, something needs to radically change in your lifestyle, and that was the neurologist. Well, the other doctor basically was asking me to not only maintain zero carb, but also go on these exhaustive runs for like 6-7 miles on a run, maybe 4 or 5 times a week. And I think the combination of that triggered. At some point, I measured my cortisol; it was through the roof. I was 2 times higher than the upper limit of normal. That freaked out the doctor, my actual regular doctor. He said, "Oh my God, maybe you have Cushing's syndrome." Well, send me for another MRI, and then still came back clean. So something is going on in your lifestyle that's causing you to overproduce cortisol, and that's around the time when I found Dr. Peat. So I kind of like stopped the zero carb experiment, but I still had the neurological symptoms.
What kind of zero carb diet were you doing? Were you trying to restrict protein?
No, I was actually, the zero carb diet was basically, I was eating the resistant starches. I was eating a lot of undercooked beans and other legumes such as lentil.
Just an observation, if you're eating resistant starch, you're not on a zero carb diet, because resistant starch metabolizes to glucose.
Right. But when I was on the zero carb, it was basically only meat and vegetables for, I would say, six months. But I don't think that's the part that really did me in. It's the combination of that with the exhaustive exercise. Again, it's the cortisol that was the indication.
You've just described my life for years. Exhaustive exercise on a meat and vegetable diet with, a lot of fat.
How did you fare?
Great.
How you did well?
Great. Yeah, great. I mean, that's
you mean low starch vegetables? You're talking, both of you?
Yeah. Low starch vegetables, green vegetables, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like asparagus, green salad, stuff like that.
Right.
So steak salad would be like my staple for many months.
So Georgie, why is it that there are a lot of the Ray Peat people say, "Oh man, low carb messed my health up so bad," but then you've got all these low carb people saying that they just feel better than ever? I mean, what's going on here? Is there different genetic factors here, or what?
It's possible.
So let's back up and go into paleo land for a little bit, right? If you go back and look at what human diets looked like for most of humanity, we would, people came down from the trees and we started eating tubers, right? We have big molars, and we have they think those evolved to eat tubers when we were in Africa, right? And then we developed this taste for carrion, and that developed us into hunters. But we still have more adaptations for eating starchy tubers than, say, a chimpanzee does, right? So we always would have, I think, in a tropical environment, been eating some amount of carbohydrate, which is why I say a ketogenic diet is, not really something that we're well adapted to. Or let me rephrase that, not necessary, because we wouldn't have been ever doing it consistently. But like a lot of other things, we probably wouldn't have been able to get tubers all the time, and we would have gone without them for periods, just like, you go without any food for periods of time when you're living depending on the local ecosystem. Now, as we got into, so I think at that point, we would have been well adapted to ketosis. And if you look at a population, the only seasonal hunter-gatherer research that I've seen done is on the Aceh, where and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, is this population in the Amazon. And they looked at what they would eat over the course of the year. The staple was fatty meat, right? And that was about 30% of their diet. And that remained constant through all the seasons. What varied was what plant matter they were eating during the rest of the season as things went in and out of season, right? So you may be, and also they noted that when they traveled, right? So when they were stable, they would have a certain layer of subcutaneous fat, which is normal for humans. And when they traveled, they would go into a ketogenic state. How do you know you're in a ketogenic state? You're losing weight, right? You're losing fat mass. That's what it's for, is to, when you're traveling, you can't get necessarily as much carbs as you would get when you're sitting there in your farm, but you've got all this fat. Your body's going to generate ketones to replace the glucose, and you're going to do just fine, but you're going to be losing fat, right? That's why I think intermittent ketosis is something that we're well adapted for and is probably the healthiest thing, just because it's forcing a turnover of fats. And it would have been something that even in Africa, where they don't really have seasons in the sense of a winter, they have a wet season and a dry season. And in the dry season, you're going to be fasting, whether you want to or not, typically. So then we get to we run out of fatty meat and we start inventing agriculture, right? And then we start seeing genetic adaptations to a high starch diet, right? And we have populations where some people, like maybe my ancestors, because I've, Nordic Celtic background, I may not be as well adapted to a high starch diet because I don't have enough copies of the amylase gene as somebody who comes from the Middle East, right? So is it possible that there are going to be, and how do we track carbohydrate consumption over all of this time? Well, we've got a really easy mechanism to do it. It's cavities, right? Paleolithic people had no cavities. Cavities were introduced into the human experience with the introduction of a high starch diet. And then every population you look at after that has a high starch diet has some level of cavities, which is higher than the Paleolithic level of 0, right? So we know that we had a period where starch consumption and carbohydrate consumption was low enough so that we didn't get cavities from it. And that when we switched over to a higher starch diet, we started seeing cavities in the fossil record and in our, when they dig up skeletons. They can tell what the guy was eating by how many cavities he had in his teeth, right? Otzi the Iceman, who was walking around with pockets full of wheat, had really bad dental decay, right? So this is one of the areas where I don't agree with Ray Peat when he says there's no evidence that we were ever in a low carb diet, period. There is good evidence because we can track it by what our teeth looked like. So, but that said, then we go through the introduction of agriculture, and it's entirely possible that we have people who adapted to the point where they have a requirement for starch in their diet, right? Or sugars. It's hard to present a counterfactual like that. So although I think that a low carb diet is optimal and a ketogenic diet is fine for most people, it's definitely possible that there are people who have adapted a requirement to a certain amount of starch in the diet.
What about the studies that show that, for example, some of the more successful drugs for improving insulin sensitivity and even potentially stop the development of diabetes are anti-lipolytic drugs? There's a drug called isipimox, which is a derivative of vitamin B3, and its main mechanism of action is drastically reducing lipolysis. Now, when you're in ketosis,
insulin drastically reduces lipolysis.
Right, but then again, so obviously you don't want to produce too much insulin because that's a sign of insulin resistance, right? However, if you're chronically in a state where your circulating free fatty acids are high and are predominantly used for fuel, the body actually, there's evidence that the body adapts. And then when you stop that period, if you actually go into a period of where you will be consuming more carbs, you will be, at least temporarily, in a state of insulin resistance. A lot of those fats.
It's what we call physiological insulin resistance. Typically, it lasts 2 or 3 days.
Okay.
I mean, look, one thing to remember, right, and this is something that's quite clear in the TPN studies where they're actually injecting fat directly into people's veins, is that just like hyperglycemia is harmful, too much fat in the bloodstream is harmful, right? Too much of any fat in the bloodstream will, for instance, cause fatty liver, right? Yep. Now, in TPN, we have this further level of evidence of they've now played around with the fat composition and they figured out, oh, certain fats always cause fatty liver. And if we get rid of those fats or lower them below some extremely low level, then we don't see fatty liver and liver damage. But what I would like to see, in answer to your question, is a population that's not eating an industrial diet, right? Are they going to have excess fatty acid levels? Because even if you look at, like, you know, the early studies of the Eskimos, who were by every standard on a low carbohydrate diet for most of the year, except when they were busy stealing blueberries from mice, they had normal glucose levels and they had no trouble passing a glucose tolerance test, right? So there wasn't any evidence of this in that population on something that's, you know, I'll call a non-industrial diet, because they weren't eating any products of the industrial food system like we are today.
So it's probably the seed oils. I mean, I'm technically fine with low carb diets if the vast majority of the fat is actually of the saturated kind. But since it's almost impossible in a modern diet to avoid those fatty acids, then it becomes an argument. Okay, so what should I do? If I go with the commercial diet, which is what most people these days are eating, they really have no, not that they don't have choice, but it takes a lot of time and effort, right, to do that. Then you're going to be ingesting a significant amount of PUFA. So in that case, what is a better diet? Is just still limiting carbs and going with that diet, or consciously basically trying to avoid the PUFA while still limiting carbs?
See, that's the thing, that when you do a low carb thing, if you're eating red meat and all that, you're still getting PUFA every day, right? If you're eating these meats, you know, you're going to get a lot of that PUFA.
But again, there's nothing wrong with getting PUFA every day.
But what if you want to drastically get your PUFA stores out? What's the most efficient, healthiest way to do it in the quickest way possible? That's what I'm asking, basically.
Well, I mean, yes, going on a high carb, no fat diet is probably going to be the most effective way to do it if you're in calorie restriction, because then essentially, you know, I mean, this is an intervention that's been around for decades, right? It's typically called a protein what is it? I can't remember the acronym, but it's high protein, low carbohydrate, and low fat. And what it forces you to do is burn fat stores for energy, right? And this is, I think, what, you know, the combination, similar to Georgi's doctor, of if you're looking to lose fat as fast as possible, the way we know that is safe and effective and efficient in doing it is to eat enough protein so you don't lose, you know,
muscle mass.
Muscle mass, thank you.
And what would that be, 80 grams a day?
As much as you want. As much as you want. I mean, a protein modified fast, and I wish I could remember the acronym, is, you know, I mean, you can get these industrial formulas, but basically, you know, I mean, this was Dr. Michael Eads, who you actually had on your show, David, quite a long time ago when I was co-hosting for you, or guest hosting for you. This was his this was how his claim to fame originally, right? It was the protein power diet. And what he did is he looked at these protein sparing modified fast. That's what it is. PSMF. So a PSMF is you take protein, no carbohydrates, no fat, or little carbohydrate, little fat. And that's what OptiFast and MetaFast are, right? And he looked at these things and he said, well, okay, but you can recreate this using real foods. And he wrote his famous book, Protein Power, which I think was like the best-selling low-carb diet book after the Atkins book. And it's a very effective way to force people to lose fat, because you need fat. And if the only way you can get fat is from your fat stores, your body is going to fix the problems that an industrial diet causes, right? Which is why people who go on a low carb diet tend to get what we call the low carb flu, or the Atkins flu. What that is in a metabolically dysfunctional state, right? You can get into a condition when you're obese where the fat globules in your cells actually move physically away from the mitochondria, right? In a healthy person, they are supposed to be adjacent to the mitochondria so that the mitochondria have a steady source of fat, right? Because that's the primary fuel of the human body. In obesity, you can become so dependent on carbohydrates that these fat globules actually move away in the cell and the mitochondria has no access to them, right? And so what's happening in the Atkins flu is you're restricting carbohydrate and your mitochondria have no other immediate source of fuel. So you go into this fuel crisis, right? And that's why people get panic attacks, they get headaches, because they're literally not able to get enough fuel while the body is saying, okay, we need to get the lipid source going to the mitochondria again, right? And that's, once that happens, then, you know, my analogy is a bathtub, right? If you plug a bathtub and you keep running water into it, it's going to fill up and it's going to start overflowing. Well, that's what's happening in obesity. Every time you eat carbohydrate, and I will disagree with Georgi on this, a comment that he made on your podcast with Brad Marshall, you don't need to eat a pound of carbohydrates a day to produce fat from the carbohydrate, right? Every time you eat carbohydrate, some of the excess carbohydrate is going to be turned into fat in your body, right? Liponeogenesis, is that the...
Yeah, lipogenesis through the citric acid. Yeah, through the citric acid and fatty acid synthase.
Right, and Finney and Volek did a study where they demonstrated this in humans, where they titrated in carbohydrate into their diet, and then they measured the saturated fat in the bloodstream, and it went up in proportion to the carbohydrate that they were eating from a fairly low level, right? Because your body only wants a tiny bit of carbohydrate in the bloodstream, like a teaspoonful, I think it is, or maybe a tablespoonful, but not much. And if you eat more than that, then your body's got a metabolic crisis, right? Excess glucose is toxic. Your body goes into disposal mode. It does that through a variety of different mechanisms, and one of them is turning it into fat, right? So let's say every day you're eating carbohydrates and you're in this continuous state where you're, you know, simplifying the model here a little bit. You're continuously eating carbohydrates. You're following the ADA's advice, right? You're saying, let's eat 8 small meals a day and it should be mostly carbohydrates. Well, what is that going to do? You are going to be in a constant state of hyperinsulinemia. You are going to impair your fat oxidation, but you're constantly producing fat. You're going to get obese. I mean, you couldn't think of a better way to make something obese. And it's as simple as the plugged bathtub. So the first thing you need to do, I think, is unplug the bathtub, right? Turn off the source of the hyperinsulinemia, which is the carbohydrate consumption, and allow your body to go back to a fat burning state, which is I mean, if you look at the amount of fuel in a person's body, you've got like 2,000 calories worth of carbohydrate and glycogen in the muscle and the liver. You've got tens of thousands of calories worth in your fat stores all throughout your body, right? That's your primary fuel source. You would never design a machine. I mean, the almost perfect analogy to this is if you look at one of these hypercars, these hybrid hypercars like Porsche and Ferrari have now made, where they have a battery and a gas tank, right? They will run for 300 miles on the gas tank, right? That's your fat source. It's literally both hydrocarbons, right? When you switch over to the battery or to your carb source, you know, one of these hypercars will go for 6 miles on the battery, 6 miles. Well, that's exactly what happens in the human body. If you try and run entirely on carbohydrates, and this is what you see in marathon runners, for instance, they go 20 miles and they bonk, right? the bonk is running out of fuel because they are so dependent on carbohydrates that they can't get access to their fat stores, right? And if you talk to these ultra runners, guys like Zach Bitter or Brown, I can't remember his first name, when they switch over to a low carbohydrate diet and they adjust to fat, which can take a couple of years to completely adjust, they never bonk anymore, right? Their performance is the same because they're able to up their fat oxidation and replace most of their requirement, not all of it, but most of their requirement for carbohydrates. And all of a sudden they can't bonk. And you wind up with guys on ketogenic diets like, gosh, I can't remember his name right now, but there was a fellow who won the Masters, set the Masters world record for the Western States 100-mile race on a ketogenic diet because he was able to almost totally replace his carbohydrates. That's the normal state of humanity, right? Is being able to hunt for days and have multiple failed hunts and still have enough energy to do that next hunt and then catch something and eat it, right? We would never have survived if we ran 20 miles and bonked and then couldn't do it again because we evolved as hunters. We have to have that capability or we'd be extinct.
So let's say all this is true, but what about the argument that just because that's what helps us survive, that's not necessarily what helps us thrive?
We know that they were thriving because they populated the entire planet. We know from looking at their skeletons that they were strong, they had healthy teeth, they were taller than we are, they had more muscle than we were. They were able to, most of these skeletons that they're looking at have evidence of multiple severe traumatic injuries that they recovered from, right? So we know that they were healthy. They had. But what about the? So then wait. So what happens? We start introducing high levels of carbohydrate into the diet, and their skeletons shrink. They get skeletal lesions from, among other things, eating too much wheat. They get cavities or teeth rot out, right? But they have more kids.
But Tucker, they can. To be fair to the Ray Peat framework, he's not really big on the starches too much either. It's about fructose. It's about, sugars and tropical fruit juice. That's not what you're seeing when you're seeing the introduction of carbs. You're seeing these starches, which are not as recommended by the Ray Peat framework, right?
But the thing one has to understand, and the thing where I think Pete gets it wrong, is that we always had access to tubers when we were in Africa, right? Even chimpanzees dig up and eat tubers. And if you go and look at any of the hunter-gatherer populations, tubers are their fallback diet, right? When they can't get meat, they eat things like mongongo nuts, which are high in linoleic acid, omega-6 fat, or tubers, right? That's been our fallback food for millions of years.
But I think what he's saying is that
down out of the trees,
can't we use the technology of agriculture to get a more efficient fuel source in the form of Florida orange juice?
I don't know that we ever would have been, look, we evolved, back when we were in the trees, we were eating a heck of a lot of fruit, right? That's
right. But we created a tech but we've created a tech just like taking cows to get milk. And so it's like through technology, we can have perhaps a more a less stressful way of getting nutrition. That's the argument from the bioenergetic paradigm, right, Georgie? Am I hearing that?
And also the fact that when you're burning fat, basically just because the fat is really the fuel, the storage form, just as you said, Tucker. Basically, when you have enough sufficient food, insulin is usually higher, and you're resting and digesting. When you're burning predominantly fat, that basically is a signal, at least to the body, that food is not in abundance. And usually burning fat goes hand in hand with activating of the hypothalamo-pituitary-adrenal axis. So a lower carb diet, at least based on the studies that I've seen in long distance runners, in people who practice these longer fasts, not necessarily the intermittent ones, but longer, like the Ramadan fast, these people have higher baseline levels of cortisol and the adrenocorticotropin releasing hormone. And it's, what would the argument that will say, look, these are really not good to be chronically elevated. So maybe, every once in a while we're forced to be in a fast, as we were back in the day, right? Because simply there's the hunt failed, or we don't have that food. So we do have a fallback diet, which is the tubers. But what is the optimal diet? Is it the tubers, or is it the meat and ripe fruit, which is what chimpanzees normally prefer?
Well, it's clearly Okay. We're not chimps, right? We've evolved to the point where humans cannot survive on a chimpanzee diet, period, end of story, right? If you tried to eat a chimpanzee diet, you would starve to death. We have a dependency for processed foods, especially cooked foods. We have a dependency for meat and fat, right?
Yeah.
Okay. There's, from the research I have done, right, since we have two companies that have been producing ketogenic diets for decades, OptiFast and MetaFast. The most successful book, the most successful diet book in history was the Atkins diet. We have, at a minimum, tens of millions of people in the United States alone who have been on a ketogenic diet for some longish term period, right? Through those three avenues, you can find in the medical literature a couple of instances of people having problems on that diet. A couple. So what tens of millions of people who were pursuing those diets. Despite what everybody was saying about the Atkins diet, there's no evidence that going on that diet is going to be detrimental to your health in the long term.
So why is this, if
now,
tens of millions of people,
that there aren't outliers.
Right. So if tens of millions of people have been on that diet, and if this diet is really so good for us, why aren't we seeing even a dent in the curves for obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease?
Because when you go to your doctor, he tells you you're going to kill yourself. So nobody sticks with it. I mean, this is like the biggest joke of these, studies that they do where they, they tell people to go on an Atkins diet. And I can just imagine the conversation. Well, we think this diet is going to kill you and lead to heart disease because it's high in saturated fat, and you'll probably also get diabetes, but we'd like you to go on it for a while so we can see what effect it has on you. Oh my goodness, nobody wants to stay on this diet. We can't understand why. It must be unpleasant. Well, I've been on that diet for years, and it's great, right? Now, what I will say is that I think when you're in a state like the state I was in and the state most Americans are in the state I was in when I started this, you have impaired carbohydrate processing, right? At that point, it's more effective to reduce carbohydrate and especially PUFA, because PUFA is causing the problem, right? Until you can heal. Once you heal, I think you should be able to reintroduce carbohydrate into your diet, as I have done. And I mean, I live in Idaho. I eat potatoes. I eat, this gluten-free, wonderful gluten-free bread that I found recently. And, I have some chocolate every once in a while that has sugar in it. And the last time I had my insulin tested, it was below 2, right? So I consider my blood glucose was a little bit on the high side, but unfortunately I did that right after a run. So that may have been why the blood glucose will go up. I mean, for folks listening who don't know, the best way to make your blood glucose and your ketones go up is to exercise, which makes perfect sense because your energy demand goes up. So energy production goes up. But I mean, with an insulin level below 2, I had people on Twitter who were like freaking out, saying, oh my goodness, that's not healthy. And I was like, look, I don't think I've got type 1 diabetes, which is a lack of insulin, and I don't know about it because I don't have any of the symptoms, right? I'm not wasting away. I have, plenty of subcutaneous fat, and, I can go and do a, 15-mile run with no food and no water on a hot day, and it's not even a problem. Right. And I don't even get hungry at the end of it. And that was one of the most interesting things that happened, because I was doing endurance exercise the whole time I was fixing my diet. And when I started out, I would go for a run and I would come back and I would be like, I bonked at 10 miles and a half marathon. So typically a bonk is at 20 miles in a marathon, right? If you do the math, that's when you run through your stored glycogen. I bonked at 10 miles in a half marathon. I saw stars. I was dizzy. I had to stop running. That's how messed up my metabolism was, right? I knew that I had fixed my metabolism when I was able to go out and do a long run on no food and get back, and I wasn't even hungry. I forgot to eat for a few hours, and that was my fastest half marathon time I'd ever done. And it was
So-
just like,
Okay.
there was no fuel shortage, right?
So to
And
go
that
back
was
to
when
his,
I was ketogenic.
His question, so your recommendation, if people want to get basically detox from years of high PUFA diet, would be to restrict carbs and go on the protein modified, what is it, the muscle sparing?
Protein sparing modified fast, which
Modified
is,
fast.
you know,
Okay.
I mean, Mike Eads' Protein Power book has been around for a long time. I've talked to him about
And what
it a
does that
lot.
actually look like? Lean chicken breast or something? Or
Yeah, I wouldn't even say you need to do lean. You know, like as Georgi has noted, a low fat diet's pretty miserable. And I mean, I tried that when I was starting out on this, and I had no idea what I was doing. You know, so just Georgi, just a little background of my experience for you and for the audience. David, I'm sure has heard this before. So when I started this, I cut out seed oils, right? And immediately lost my carbohydrate cravings. And we can go into why that happened, right? So for a few weeks, I was on a high protein, you know, whatever amount of protein with fat I was eating, and vegetables diet with no supplemental fat and no supplemental carbohydrate. And I went into rabbit starvation, right? Rabbit starvation is essentially protein toxicity, because humans don't have a capacity, on like a cat, to survive on just protein. You need protein and some energy source, either carbohydrate or fat, probably because you need, you know, as we discussed before, you're going to convert carbohydrate into fat. Probably because you also need fat to go with the protein to help you digest it, right? So I put myself into rabbit starvation. It was a miserable experience. I mean, just all of a sudden one day I started having this mad craving for fat. And luckily I'd read enough at that point. So I was like, you know, I mean, I was ravenous and I'd eaten. And on the way home, I stopped at a health food store and I got myself a jar of coconut oil. And I went home and I ate the coconut oil with a tablespoon until the craving went away, right? That's a miserable experience. So I wouldn't say go on a strict, super high protein and vegetable diet, because you're going to be miserable and it's probably going to make you fail. I would say, you know, go on a more, you know, low carb paleo diet where you're eating fatty meat, you're eating beef, right? You want to be eating the meats that have low PUFA. So you're going to avoid chicken and pork. And you're going to be eating beef with some fish, lamb, you know, which tends to have a lot of PUFA, but the healthier varieties.
Goat.
And goat, yeah. I mean, any ruminant, right? Goats, lamb, beef. I don't know what else.
Kangaroo is also pretty nice. Apparently,
Kangaroo's
ostrich.
super lean, though, right? I have eaten kangaroo. I've also eaten emu. There was a Australian restaurant in New York years ago that I used to go to. Super lean.
what about the argument, though, that if we're going to do it evolutionarily speaking, that you should be eating the, you know, the gelatin and things that would go along with the skin and everything and connective tissue with those meats?
I put gelatin in my coffee every morning. So yeah, I've seen, you
But
know,
are you
as
supposed
part-
to eat it with the meat for it to be effective, Georgie? You can't. Can you eat it with time space between and still be effective at balancing the muscle meat proteins?
The latter is true. It will still be effective, but it's best to take it with the meat because it helps to balance some of the more inflammatory amino acids, such as the cysteine, tryptophan, and methionine.
Right. And I agree with that. I mean, when I eat a steak, you know, when I'm finished, the only thing left on the plate is the bone. I eat all the gristle, I eat all the fat. I don't cut all that stuff off because it's tough to chew. I eat the chewy bits, and that's, you know, gelatin, again, for the audience, is what you find in connective tissue. That's how you make gelatin. You know, boil bones or boil a tendon or whatever, the stuff that's hard. Yeah, the skin, the stuff that's hard to chew. And, you know, if we were hunter-gatherers, we would eat that stuff because you're hungry all the time when you're a hunter-gatherer, and you don't throw stuff like that away. And I mean, your dog will eat that stuff, and we are well adapted to digest that stuff, right? And it's beneficial not only in giving us amino acids in the balance that we're supposed to be getting them, because we're supposed to eat the whole animal, but it also is healthy for the gut microbiome because it's a form of fiber, and it feeds a healthier gut microbiome than just, if you're just eating high protein. So yeah, I absolutely agree with that.
So Georgie but the problem is a lot of people find that when they do keto or low carb diets long term, they're less and less effective as they keep trying them, and that cortisol goes up, and you're basically stressing out your system, you're stressing out your body to do this. And I think the argument, from the bioenergetic perspective, is maybe you live a little longer, but you are not really having a quality of life that you would have if you had more of an abundance based eating thing, which is more encompassing with the bioenergetic approach, right, Georgie? You're trying to say an abundance model where you're getting the optimal fuel. You're not, because you're against the whole no pain, no gain approach to exercise too, which is all part of this kind of death framework of our culture, which is if health is dying, health is starving yourself, health is running and throwing up at the gym. It's all about this kind of self-flagellation paradigm of health. And the bioenergetic approach is against that, right? It's about saying, hey, let's do things that are less stressful. And,
let's be clear, I'm against that too.
Okay.
And I don't think as somebody who loves to run and loves to backpack and stuff, I run because I enjoy it, not because I feel that I need to. I mean, there are definite benefits to go along.
Right. I'm trying to find the best off-ramp for the average American person to be safe from the PUFA toxicity that's in this system. One of the things that appeals to me about the Ray Peat model of healing from PUFA damage is, I believe with this great reset and all this stuff, they're going to make meat harder and harder to afford. And I've been telling my friends and family, I said, you know what, maybe the keto thing's just as effective. I don't know. But if I can live an abundant, healthy life with orange juice and potatoes versus a ribeye a day to be healthy, I know that's kind of a cartoon of the two paradigms, but for the average person, they might be able to eat potatoes and a carrot and orange juice, a little bit of milk, a little bit more affordable than, a very carnivore style heavy diet. So there's a practical factor that weighs towards the bioenergetic approach, which I think should be considered for the average person that's trying to be healthy.
David, let me clarify something. I think keto is best as an intervention, right? I don't think it's necessary in the long term. If you are able to fix your system such that you can start burning glucose again, then by all means, knock yourself out, right?
What does it mean to start burning glucose again? Like I thought if you drink orange juice, you're not going to be stimulating insulin, right? So you don't have to worry about if you
have high levels of PUFA in your system and you go on a high carbohydrate diet, you are creating oxidative stress. And now we can get into this topic, which is going to cause the PUFA to break down into toxins in your body, right? There's a wonderful paper that exemplifies this perfectly, where they had rats on a high carb diet, which is the standard rat diet, and then they added in PUFA to it, right? And then they made the rats diabetic by giving them a toxin, right? The rats on the high PUFA diet were sicker than the rats on the high carb diet who were given a toxin to make them diabetic, right? That combination of carbohydrate and omega-6 fats is probably the worst thing that you can do for yourself. And what happened to these rats is that their mitochondria actually broke down, right? And then when they got made diabetic, then they started suffering from necrosis and heart failure, right? That combination is the worst possible thing.
So are you suggesting, just to clarify,
that combination is the American diet?
So, but are you suggesting, for clarification, that if someone were to do a Ray Peat style intervention, they're not eating any PUFA, or at least as much as possible, and they try to do a high sugar diet, that's actually going to be more damaging to them to do that as an intervention? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes. I would not do that. I would not recommend that, because, we have a really great animal model showing that that's highly toxic. So why would you want to do that? And it may be effective because you're going to break the PUFA down, But I think the way you want to get rid of them is by oxidizing them for fuel, right? And
But
now
isn't that damaging to the body to oxidize them as fuel?
No. And the unique thing about a ketogenic diet in the context of oxidizing omega-6 PUFA for fuel is that you also can oxidize the toxins for fuel, as opposed to having them going out and damaging your proteins and causing all of the problems. You know, in Georgi's discussion with Brad Marshall, he did a long monologue of all of the metabolic problems that happen. Every single one of them is caused by a single chemical in the body on a high PUFA diet, right? And if you're in a ketogenic state, you can actually burn that chemical for fuel, which is, I think, the optimal way to get rid of it.
So here, one small interjection. Peat is not against processing the PUFA, but he thinks it's better to allow the liver to glucuronidate and sulfate it, and basically then you pee it out instead of having it flood your tissues through excess lipolysis. And he quotes several studies which subsequently have been confirmed in humans that most of the damage in people with type 2 diabetes, especially to the kidneys and liver, comes from circulating PUFA. So wouldn't you be increasing that amount of PUFA? Yeah.
The intermittent step to pee it out is the creation of the toxins, right? And then the toxins get bound to glutathione, and that's how they get peed out as bound glutathione. I forget the term, but
I think the Peat's model is they get bound to
toxicity.
In Peat's model they get bound to glucuronic acid, and basically, which is synthesized from glucose, and then basically they become more water soluble, and that's what allows you to pee them out. So when you have foamy urine in the morning or after a stressful event, that's actually all the free fatty acids that your body, your liver, your other organs couldn't oxidize that were floating around in the bloodstream, and the liver took some of them, turned them into more water-soluble compounds, and then you peat them out. They basically form a substance like a soap, because that's really what a soap is. It's the sodium attached to a fatty acid, right? And in this case, it's the glucuronic acid attached to a fatty acid, and then when it's in the water, in your urine, it makes foam. So Peat is saying that, sure, it's better to excrete them instead of burning them, because in order to burn them, you actually have to get them out of the fatty tissues. But if you get them out...
You don't pee fat, right? It has to be broken down into something else.
You actually pee out fatty acids attached to glucuronic acid. I can show you studies on that.
And what quantity?
Well, it depends on how well your liver is functioning. Basically, if you have fatty liver disease, then you won't be able to pee nearly as much.
Peeing fat, it's like peeing glucose, right? Peeing energy is a pathological state. Period. End of story, right?
Yeah, it is.
Now, if you have excess, if you are, when you go into a ketogenic diet, typically you pee out ketones, and partly that's because you're not able to use them as fuel, and it's difficult to store ketones, so you pee them out, right? Same thing happens when you're diabetic. Neither one of those is a normal state. I mean, if you look at Eskimos and they do a urine ketone test, they don't have any ketones, which is what you would expect, because they're not pissing out energy. Energy is hard to come by.
Right, but the example I'm giving is that in diabetic ketoacidosis, we know it's caused by excess fat in the bloodstream because they administer insulin, which lowers lipolysis.
No, it's not caused by excess fat in the bloodstream. It's
what is it? What is it called?
An absence of insulin, right? Which, I mean, that's a totally pathological state, and it's not equivalent to nutritional ketosis.
I'm not saying it's equivalent, but isn't it like a more extreme form? Basically, you flood so much fat into the bloodstream, then you basically a lot of that fat and the ketones that are created from it, they cannot get oxidized. So they basically block the insulin receptor almost completely.
No.
And you need an extra.
Other way around. It's caused by an absence of insulin. That only happens in type 1 diabetes.
Type 2 diabetes, actually, you can have diabetic ketoacidosis.
Only under extreme circumstances, but you have to remember, in advanced type 2 diabetes, they become type 1 diabetics.
You can, yeah. Basically, you're so insulin resistant that no matter how much insulin you produce, it's not doing the job that it does. But again, if you end up in a hospital with type 2 diabetic ketoacidosis, the treatment is insulin, right? Even if the person their insulin levels are not, yes, exactly, it's insulin resistant.
Right.
But I mean, maybe my understanding is incorrect here, but the goal is to lower the levels of free fatty acids in the blood, and that's why they're administering the insulin. Alternatively, there's this drug that I mentioned earlier, acipimox, which is a vitamin B3 derivative, which when you give it, that it acts to a receptor to block lipolysis, and it's also used to stop diabetic ketoacidosis. So in
Right.
both cases, they seem to be trying to act against the presence of too much fat into the bloodstream.
Right. Well, yes. I mean, as I said before, too much fat, just like too much glucose, is harmful, right? Your body carefully regulates levels of all the fuels in the bloodstream because, ketoacidosis is harmful, right?
Right.
That doesn't mean
So
ketones are harmful. It just means too much of them is harmful.
I'm not saying they're harmful, but my question is, if a person is on a low carb diet and they're trying to lose all of this excess PUFA in the bloodstream and whatnot, and let's say they're starting exercising as well, how do they protect themselves from getting to a situation where there's too much lipolysis? Because obese people tend to end up with a lot of lipolysis simply because they have all this fat stored.
As I said, there are literally millions of people who have been on a ketogenic diet, and I think there are 1 or 2 instances of people going into ketoacidosis. Now that people are going on SGLT2 inhibitors, that as a side effect, especially on a low-carb diet, has ketoacidosis, but it just doesn't happen physiologically in a non-type 1 or type 1 diabetic person. It just doesn't happen.
What about the idea that long-term low-carb dieting and eating is going to be destructive to the thyroid and increasing cortisol and stressing out your body in the long term? Even if you're not in ketosis, you're just you're hovering around that low-carb world and restricting access to, sugar consumption. What about that?
Georgi, I'll let you take that one, or do you want me to take it?
I mean, I think there's strong evidence that PUFA is detrimental to the thyroid. In fact, some of the omega-6 fatty acids can actually block the thyroid receptor alpha. And then it can cause, I guess, a state of thyroid insufficiency. But I think the more concerning part is the studies that I saw that people who are chronic on a low carb diet, they basically start to overexpress the cortisol producing enzyme 11 beta HSD type 1. And then even once this adaptation occurs, you have actually starting your cells adapt to producing more of that enzyme. So your baseline cortisol will be higher even if you stop that diet. Now the question is that permanent, or can you adapt back to a low cortisol state? Do you have an opinion on how much of a concern cortisol is on a low carb diet?
Well, yeah, I do have an opinion. It may even be right. Let's see. But I mean, I will agree with your first statement about, I have yet to find an organ that excess PUFA is not harmful to. So while I haven't looked specifically into the thyroid, I've looked into steroid production, and it's clearly harmful there. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me at all. But the first question is, what do thyroid hormones do? And when I asked this question, it was unbelievably hard to find an answer to it, right? One of the most important things that they do is they're intimately involved in glucose disposal. Mm-hmm. So, as I mentioned, your body needs only a tiny bit of glucose in the bloodstream, and anything that you eat beyond that, is rapidly absorbed through your intestine, through the liver, and released into the bloodstream. And your body then has to get rid of it because glucose is very tightly homeostatically regulated. So the most important mechanism for doing that is the thyroid, right? Thyroid hormones are potentiators of insulin. They make insulin more effective, right? Mm-hmm. So on a high carbohydrate diet, your thyroid output is going to be higher, just like your insulin output is going to be higher. And on a low carbohydrate diet, your thyroid production is going to be lower, just like your insulin production is going to be lower. And that's not a problem, right? And again, we get back to these millions of people who are on these, ketogenic diets through these 3 mechanisms I mentioned before, 3 pathways I mentioned before. And do we have any evidence of long-term thyroid damage? No, there isn't any, right? It's perfectly natural, just like low insulin is perfectly natural on a low carb diet. Low thyroid hormone is healthy. Now, there are other things that can mess it up. A lot of people have thyroid problems because of gluten intake. Hashimoto's is a commonly goes along with celiac disease, and a lot of people who report having Hashimoto's when they go on a gluten-free diet are able to reverse it, right? But that's an autoimmune condition that's separate from either low carb or PUFA intake. So yeah, I haven't seen any evidence for it.
You're saying that you think it's okay to have a basically, as long as insulin is low, having lower output of thyroid hormone is also not a problem. So having
It's
lower,
expected.
okay, so lower basal metabolic rate, in your opinion, is not a problem.
But that's not the same thing as lower basal metabolic rate, right? It
Well,
doesn't
wouldn't that be
lower
controlled
basal.
mostly?
You have two functions in the thyroid. You have basal metabolic rate and then carbohydrate disposal.
Right.
Right. So you can go, I mean, the problem is when they look at these, when they do these studies to try and figure out what's the correct rate of thyroid hormone, they never look at ketogenic people because for most of US history, it was hard to find ketogenic people. Right. And if you go into a study and you say, oh, I'm on a ketogenic diet, they're going to be like, oh, excluded. You're not on a normal healthy diet, so we're not going to include you. So their definition, their statistical definition of normal is skewed towards a high carbohydrate diet, even though we know without any question that that's an evolutionary novelty for humans. Right. I mean, 55% carbohydrate is not what we would have eaten prior to the invention of agriculture.
So you say our definition of a normal basal metabolic rate is actually skewed in favor of the high carbohydrate diet. And the people who have lower thyroid hormone, they're not necessarily low metabolic simply because we have not included them in the past in our calculations.
Right. And if you look at the metabolic rate on people who go on a ketogenic diet, it doesn't decline. If anything, I think it goes up from some of the stuff that I've seen. I mean, certainly in my case, having been on it for years, I mean, my metabolic rate. I'll tell you a little anecdote about this. My wife and I went skiing and it was really warm and snowing like crazy. And her gloves got so soaked that they froze into claws. Right. And she was like, okay, we've got to go back to the lodge so I can dry off. And I was like, they were gloves that I'd loaned her, so they fit me. So I said, no, we'll just switch gloves. 2 runs, about 15 minutes, I thawed the gloves out and completely dried them just with my hands. So 10-ish years on a ketogenic diet, and I have a freakishly high metabolic rate.
Well, if you're in a cold environment due to the cold thermogenesis and the browning of the fatty tissue and the high adrenaline, you could have a high metabolic rate, but that's because driven by stress hormone, not necessarily because it's...
This is consistent for me for years. I mean, I've been doing cold adaptation since I was in my 20s, and you just adapt to it, right? I don't have any evidence I don't have any negative evidence. My cortisol levels are normal. My insulin's super low. It's just.
So how is what he's saying possible in the bioenergetic approach, Georgi?
Maybe he's adapted to burning fat, and basically he can maintain, a particular daily caloric expenditure with this hormonal profile. I don't know if this would work for everybody. Maybe it's not for everybody, just like maybe the high carb diet is not for everybody.
I just want to, it may be that it's always just going to be a multiplicity of options, but I feel like a lot of folks are just so confused, and I want to give people an off-ramp to the PUFA toxicity, and I want it to be something that's economically efficient, but also something that actually, really seems to be an efficient solution to this problem. And yet you're saying that you don't need a strong thyroid to function on keto or something?
No. You will have a strong thyroid. What you won't have, just like you'll have a strong pancreas, what you won't have is a high output of hormones that are not needed, right? They are used for glucose disposal. They increase your metabolic rate because when you eat glucose, there are a few things that your body can do with it. It can burn it as fuel immediately. And this happens because insulin turns off lipolysis and cuts down the fat supply in your blood, which forces your body to use glucose for fuel because fat's not available, right? That's the biggest way of doing it. The second way of doing it is by converting it into glycogen. Again, we have limited glycogen storage. You can only, and if they're full, that avenue is not open at all. And the third way of doing it is by increasing your metabolic rate. You're literally burning it off, right? You are burning it off like waste natural gas at an oil plant. You're just getting rid of it. And that, you know, that last avenue is not, that's controlled by the thyroid, and that's not needed if you're not consuming glucose.
What about this idea that gluconeogenesis is very stressful to the body to get?
Well, look, humans are hunters, right? We would, I mean, if you look at, you know, I'm looking at my dog down here. We partnered with wolves and co-evolved with wolves. Wolves are a carnivore who eat in the wild 1% or less carbohydrate, right? Why did we partner with this animal? Because they were eating the same way that we are eating. Wolves eat a fast famine or a feast famine dietary pattern. They eat when they catch prey, and they don't eat when they don't catch prey. Humans are the same way. I mean, if you read accounts of like the Plains Indians, who were one of the few Paleolithic species where we have a written record of what they were doing when they encountered, you know, quote unquote, I don't even want to call it the modern world, I guess call it agricultural humans, right? They would go out and they would catch buffalo, and there were lots of buffalo around. But when the Plains Indians got ready for battle, they fasted. Now, if fasting is so detrimental and you're getting ready to fight a war, why would you do that? You'd lose, right?
Because it raises your cortisol and adrenaline and makes you pumped up, but at the expense of destroying a lot of tissue.
It doesn't make you pumped up, right? Cortisol, what cortisol is doing, when you run out of glycogen, cortisol is a signal for your body to break down protein in the body to make more glucose and ketones, right? Amino acids are either ketogenic or glucogenic. They're not one or the other. It's not like, and that's a common misconception in the ketogenic world, that if you're breaking down proteins, you're making glucose. You're making glucose and ketones because your body wants both fuel sources always in a natural state, right? But we would not, again, just like a wolf, you know, we would go days without eating because we were hunting or we were out, you know, roaming around. I mean, there's a famous story about this guy, liver eating Johnson, who was a mountain man. Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty good anecdote in that they had a first person interview with him at the end. And he fought a Indian tribe, the Crow, for years. And the Crow sent out 10 braves to hunt him for 10 years, right? And they were all out living where I live now, in Idaho and Montana and Wyoming. They weren't eating carbohydrates, right? Not all year round, that's for sure, because there's nothing available here in the winter except for animal sources of foods.
Okay, so the question again is, just because we can live in the same lifestyle, feast and famine, just like the wolves, do we have evidence that that we should be practicing this deliberately as ways to health, versus if we have an abundance of fuel, easily digestible fuel, like let's say ripe fruits, what maybe we should be going for that?
I think the better question is, and this is what you always come up with in the ketogenic, I think it's pretty clear that humans evolved to be at least intermittently fasting, intermittently ketogenic, and intermittently very low carb, right? I mean, we have written accounts of that being a normal state in healthy populations. Again, the Plains Indians, when the Europeans first encountered them, were taller and healthier, right? And they didn't have agriculture. They existed entirely as hunter-gatherers, right? And they were more healthy. I mean, the best indication we have of health is height, right? It's the single best indication that a population is healthy is how tall it is, right? And the first thing that happened when agriculture was invented is everybody shrunk by from like 6'4" down to like 5'5" or less, right?
But this could be because of the PUFA in the grains, not necessarily of the increase in carbohydrates in the diet.
No, I think it's clearly because of the increase in carbohydrates, because carbohydrates aren't nutritious, right? In order for a carbohydrate diet to be nutritious, every single disease of malnutrition that's associated with carbohydrates is due to malnutrition. Beriberi is due to a thiamine deficiency, right? In rice, if you eat nothing but rice, you die of malnutrition. right? You don't get enough of a vitamin that's found in meat. If you eat nothing but corn, you get pellagra, which is another vitamin B
B3.
deficiency. B3,
Yeah.
thank you, deficiency, which you find in meat, right? So every one of these vitamin deficiencies that you find in agricultural populations is caused by the lack of nutrition in carbohydrates, right? So I think it's so.
Here's an example.
The question then becomes, what's the level of carbohydrate that you can eat and still have a healthy diet?
Sure.
And it's pretty high. It's like, 20, 30% combined with fatty meats and fruits and vegetables. So I think that's a reasonable diet, to get back to David's point. Where should you be in the longer term? That's a reasonable place. And it means that if you come from, as pretty much everybody on the planet does now, a culture that has a tradition of eating some level of carbohydrates, right? Whether it's dumplings or I don't know for, Bulgaria, what you would eat. But, for the Japanese, it's rice. For the Latin Americans, it's corn. Yeah, all of that can be part of a healthy diet, so long as you're getting enough meat and fruits and vegetables.
So here's an example, since you gave an example of the Native Americans. There is a tribe called the Tsimane, which lives in the Amazon. You've probably heard of them. They eat 80 to 90% carbohydrate diet and almost exclusively from starch. They have 0 cases of cardiovascular disease. How would we explain that?
Well, first off, if you go talk to the Tsimane, they all complain about the fact that they can't get enough meat to eat.
Sure.
Right. But they also don't get any, there's a really funny, I've looked into them a lot, and there's a really funny correlation that they discovered in the Tsimane, is that they are now starting to get obese. They are starting to get exposed to industrial foods. And the correlation in that population was between having a motorboat and obesity, right? Why would people who have a motorboat be obese? Well, for one thing, they were wealth. Wealth is associated with higher levels of subcutaneous fat because you can get more food to eat. But that also meant that they were able to go to market and get market foods. And then they did an analysis of, okay, what is causing their increased rates of obesity? And the answer was vegetable oils. That they're starting to get market foods means foods with vegetable oils in them. And I'm sure they're going to start getting, heart disease, just like everybody else who starts eating it, industrial foods does.
So it was the PUFA that is actually the detrimental factor, not the carbs in their case. Why wouldn't it be the same with the Native Americans? Basically, the reason they were so healthy is because they had almost no consumption of PUFA.
Tsimane are short.
Okay.
Right? They're malnourished. They're all malnourished. It's just like what was the population in Mexico? Christopher McDougall talked about them in his book Born to Run, and I can't remember the name of them right now, but they're famous. They live in the Copper Canyon area.
Oh yeah, they run 50, 100 kilometers a day. They eat chia seeds or whatever. It's like they're
exactly. And I can't remember the. Anyway.
I'm blanking on their name either. But shouldn't the Tsimane have very high rates of all of these diseases and obesity if they eat so much carbs?
Let's talk about this other population. They also eat mostly carbohydrates, right? What's the malnutrition rate in their children? 80%.
Okay.
Right? Let me look up the name of this tribe real quick because I can find it in a sec.
And Georgie, isn't it true? Ray Peat, when asked, he said, he was thinking about what is the most efficient way to harvest the energy from the sun. And he came up with, like a fruit juice, orange juice, ripened fruit, as you describe it. And then the second would be like milk, right? From a cow.
Yeah.
So if you were drinking orange juice and milk, would you be malnourished, Tucker?
Long term, absolutely.
Why?
Because it doesn't have all the stuff that you need. I mean, a milk diet, they've done RCTs in humans, right? They take a malnourished human on a plant-based diet, right? How do you malnourish a human? You put them on a high-carb plant-based diet, and they fed them milk or meat. And the children were all stunted. Again, sign of health is short stature. And they put them on a milk diet. They added milk or meat. The kids who were eating meat recovered faster than the kids who were getting milk, because milk doesn't have all the stuff that you need to be healthy.
So you have milk and orange juice. Milk is deficient in iron. I'll give you that. But what about the studies that showed you can not only survive, but thrive on a diet of nothing but potatoes?
Well, potatoes, well, first off, I don't know of any population that ever in history ate nothing but potatoes. I mean, even the Irish were eating potatoes.
What about that
dairy,
group
and
in
meat.
Polynesia or whatever that near the that eat sweet potatoes
The
and had pig?
Tukasenta. Yeah, 94% from sweet potatoes, but they were also getting pork and vegetables. Right? I'm not aware of a single population that ate nothing but potatoes long term. I mean, it's amazing how, you know, little protein you can get away with eating. I mean, the Japanese did that, right? But again, the Japanese are all short. If you go to Japan, as I have done, you will be amazed by how small they are on average compared to, you know, look at the tallest population in the world is the Dutch. What do the Dutch eat a lot of? They eat
Georgie,
a lot of
is shortness considered a sign of malnutrition in the bioenergetic paradigm, or is that something?
It's considered a sign of stress, mostly high cortisol and estrogen, because estrogen fuses the plates in your spinal cord and in your joints, and basically you don't grow as tall. And there's some cases where administering anti-estrogenic drugs, at least in teenagers, where the growth has not completely stopped yet, you can actually get them to grow a little taller.
That's interesting.
Yeah, but yeah, malnutrition can do it, certainly. But I'm just curious why several populations around the world that eat almost nothing but carbs are not developing the obesity which we're expecting to see, as you said.
I don't think obesity has anything to do with carbohydrates. I think
didn't we discuss earlier that if you eat carbs, basically, like, you know,
with a high PUFA diet.
Oh yeah, with high PUFA diet. Yeah, with that I would agree. Yeah. Okay, so back to the question. Getting rid of PUFA is paramount, right? So if you've already accumulated it.
Totally agreed.
So you advocate high lipolysis. Well, no, I shouldn't say high lipolysis. You advocate low carb so you can actually oxidize all of that PUFA that's already in your tissues.
Right.
Do you think adding saturated fat while you're on that period will help buffer some of the negative effects of having PUFA floating around?
I don't think you need to, because from what I have read, fat is stored in adipose tissue roughly in the proportion that you eat, right? PUFAs are preferentially oxidized on the way in. So when they are released from adipose tissue, they're going to be released in proportion to their storage levels in adipose tissue. So effectively what you're doing is just continuing on the diet you were eating up until the day you decided to eat PUFAs for a little longer until you burn it off.
Okay.
And I don't know of any other way to do it. I don't know of anything else that's going to be effective. That's why I say the lower the fat intake that you can deal with, the faster you're going to force yourself to oxidize it. But, you know.
So do you know of the drug dinitrophenol that was used as a weight loss drug back in the early 20th century?
Yeah, it causes decoupling and people died from overheating.
Right. So, but that drug, no, I'm not, definitely not. But I'm bringing it up because it's basically a metabolic rate increaser in a sense, right? You just convert most of the energy to heat, not necessarily to ATP.
Oh yeah, work great.
Yeah, it worked great if it doesn't kill you, exactly. But it manages to get rid of this extra fat by having your cells actually consume it internally without actually having to go through the lipolysis situation, which is what I guess going on.
Just to explain to folks what it's basically doing is it's ramping up your metabolic rate, right? And that's why it would kill people, is that they would literally bake from the inside out, burned to death by their mitochondria, which were doing, I mean, typically your you know, it's like if you have a gasoline engine in your car and you have a clutch, you can either use the gas to drive the car around, or you can disengage the clutch and run the engine, and, you know, eventually
you burn up.
Yeah, eventually the engine will overheat because there's no airflow through the engine to cool it off. That's what DNP does, is get you into that state where the clutch is disengaged.
So what about the argument, okay, T3 is another uncoupler, right? Why not take thyroid hormone to get rid of this excess weight / PUFA through a similar mechanism?
People have done that, and I've seen mixed efficacy on it. And I mean, the problem with doing hormones is that typically hormones, you know, the clutch in your car only does one thing.
Right.
Hormones do all sorts of things. And I mean, the amazing thing about biology, as I'm sure you will say, is that I don't think there's anything in the body that only has a single function.
It's all systemic. I agree. Yeah.
Right. And they're all, you know, they all do multiple different things. I mean, even the toxins that we talk about, you know, a lot of the processes that we're describing here that are pathologic in the context of an industrial diet are perfectly normal in the context of an evolutionary diet. Like, you know, one of the worst and best studied toxins, HNE, produced from linoleic acid, it's a decoupler, right? In an evolutionary context, it shows that you're suffering from mitochondrial damage and it decouples the mitochondria, right? And that's perfectly normal. It's just when you have a body that is packed full of omega-6 fats and that's produced, it causes massive breakdown of every system that it touches.
Okay, so I guess you are against chemically stimulating getting rid of the PUFA, and it can be, because you're saying it can be done mostly through the diet.
I'm not against it per se. I mean, we've got, you know, so we've got this drug rimonabant, right? And this is one of the most interesting pathways. You know, we haven't even touched on the endocannabinoid system yet, right? So rimonabant is the endocannabinoid system is this system in your body where, you know, it's a signaling system. It's involved in food control, right? Whether or not you're hungry, and also in addiction, whether or not you're addicted to a food.
Pain.
Yeah, you know, again, a lot of different functions, right? Mood, importantly for this example. So the endocannabinoid system that we're interested in here is linoleic acid is converted in the gut into arachidonic acid, which is converted into two chemicals, 2-AG and AEA, which both cause hunger, right?
Okay.
Clear pathway. I mean, it works great in animals, you know, and it's the same pathway that's stimulated by THC, right? So everybody's familiar with the munchies, right? So rimonabant was this drug that blocks the uptake of these chemicals it blocked the uptake of everything into the endocannabinoid system, unfortunately. But it was effective as a weight loss drug, and it's super effective in animals. And what's really interesting about this as an intervention is you can keep eating an obesogenic diet, and if you block the uptake of those chemicals into the endocannabinoid system, the obesogenic diet will not be obesogenic any longer, right? So it's a key intervention. The problem was it made people a little bit more likely to commit suicide. So what does medicine do? They turn around and they say, okay, we can't use this drug because 3 extra people committed suicide or wanted to commit suicide than in the control arm. So we're not going to, we're going to revoke the approval of the drug. So what does medicine turn around and do? They come up with the idea of the gastric bypass. What does the gastric bypass do? It's a lobotomy of your endocannabinoid system, and it blocks the effect of those drugs on your gut, right? But it's got a much higher suicide rate than the drug. Many, many, many times higher. So,
I have a safer alternative to both. Pregnenolone is the most potent available natural blocker of the endocannabinoid system. They came out in the news recently they say if you don't want to get the marijuana high, take it with some pregnenolone, and it basically blocks all of those effects. So it should be effective.
My point here was, you know, I think they should bring back rimonabant because it's far less harmful than the surgical procedure that
I agree.
Right? The side effects are the same, the mechanism is the same.
More invasive, you can get infection, you can die from all of these different things.
Oh my God, the mortality rate, I mean, you know, gastric bypass surgery doubles your mortality rate for any given period of time.
Wow, I didn't know that. I thought it was like a harmless little thing people talk about.
No, it's a horrible procedure, and it's one of those things like lobotomy that I think, you know, we're going to look back on it in 30 years and be like, what the hell were they thinking?
It's a major abdominal surgery. They cut all layers. They also can damage the vagus nerve very often.
Well, that
wreaks all kinds of havoc. Yeah.
When the surgery is not effective, it's not effective because they're not severing the nerves.
Okay.
There's another nerve in addition to the vagus nerve. I can't remember what it's called right now. And the endocannabinoid system is still intact, right? But then they also tell you, because the gut's amazing at healing, they also tell you still have to change your diet. And what do they put you on? They put you on a low-carb diet.
Yeah.
I mean, it's insane. And now, granted, for some people, you know, for whatever reason, they can't go on a low carb diet. I talked to Eric Westman, who, wrote the most recent edition of the Atkins diet book and has practiced with, thousands of patients. And I said, does this ever not work? And he said, no, it always works, but some people can't follow it. And if you can't follow it, it doesn't work, obviously, right?
Now, so Tucker, what's the problem with going with this intervention for someone who's overweight from PUFA, from years of eating it, and now they're going to go to drinking, a quart of orange juice and a quart and a half of low-fat milk, 1% milk, and they're eating very well boiled potatoes. They're eating bamboo shoots, very well boiled mushrooms. They're doing the classic repeat. Maybe they're eating liver once a week to get some of those vitamins. Maybe they're eating some oysters once a week. What's wrong with that as an intervention for PUFA in your estimation? I know it's not.
You're eating a traditional Japanese diet at that point, which is a very health promoting diet.
So you don't have a problem with that as an intervention then?
No, I just don't know that it's necessarily the most effective intervention, but it's not going to be, I don't know about orange juice and, low fat milk. That I would expect to be miserable for any length of time.
Why? The taste or something? Or what's the miserable part of that then?
I mean, Georgi said he tried it for a month and he hated it. So I'll
go
with his experience.
It was only I tried zero fat milk, basically, as because that was the study that Peat quoted. A guy in the 30s, I think he did it, went on a fat-free diet, and he was only doing fat-free milk and to cure his chronic migraines or whatever.
The other problem with a fat-free or low-fat diet long-term is it causes organ failure, right? I mean, it causes your gallbladder to fail.
But what if you're doing 1% low-fat milk, a quart and a half of that a day? Aren't you going to get enough fats to be healthy? And then you're getting your oysters once a week. You're getting your liver once a week. So you're putting a little bit of muscle. You're putting a little animal supplementation. But aren't you going to get less PUFA and enough fat?
You're going to get less PUFA and you're going to get organ failure, right?
How long? How long would that take to get to that problem?
They've seen it in dietary intervention trials in literature, where they put people on, a low-fat diet for X number of months, and a lot of them start seeing gallbladder failure within that time frame.
Georgi, have you seen that literature to suggest that?
I haven't. I can see people with gallbladder stones having problems because the fat stimulates the gallbladder to get rid of some of its stones.
Yeah.
Whether that happens in everybody or just in people who already have problems with the gallbladder, I cannot comment on because I haven't seen the studies.
So you're saying,
I mean, it's entirely blocked by a high enough fat intake.
So Tucker, at first, I want to make sure we're clear here. At first, you said I don't see how you're basically eating a Japanese diet. I just don't think it's the most effective way to heal from PUFA.
The Japanese had a very high rate of gallbladder problems.
Okay. So you're saying it's not something you would recommend. So that's your issue then, is the organ failure?
Well, I mean, let's look at the Japanese diet. They have a long life expectancy. They're, I'll probably get into trouble for saying this. They're all stunted.
They're short, yeah.
Right. They're well adapted to that diet because they've been eating it for a long time, and they have some specific genetic adaptations to it, apparently, from what I've looked into. They had high rates of gallbladder disease, just looking at the literature coming out of Japan. So yeah, I mean,
Georgi, is it an
optimal way to do it? No. Is it, a healthy way to do it? I mean, my daughter lives in Japan, and when, it's really fun. It's really funny. In the United States, we have the freshman 15, right? When you go to college, you put on 15 pounds. Some schools, it's the freshman 40, right?
Wow.
Right. In Japan, they have the freshman 15. Except in Japan, it's when foreigners come to Japan, they lose 15 pounds like that. And they go on a high carb, low fat diet, right? And they immediately lose weight. And my daughter is leaner there than she's ever been here. But I have to tell her, honey, make sure you're eating enough meats. Don't go because you need it, right? Of course, she's 5 feet and a half inches, so we're not worried about stunted. She's happy there because she fits right in. She's like average height for a woman in Japan. And
well, maybe that's why Ray recommends the liver. Basically, your recommendation for meat is covered by his recommendation for weekly liver, a veal liver.
the Japanese eat a lot of seafood, and I just think as a short-term intervention, great. I don't know if a person.
What's short term for you? 2 months, 6 months, a year?
2 months or 6 months, and if you start having gallbladder problems, you need to stop immediately.
How would you know you have gallbladder problems on a Peat diet?
Oh, you'll know.
What does that mean?
Pain right here,
Massive
and then
pain.
and maybe diarrhea because you wouldn't be digesting the fat.
Pain
Which
where?
you're not eating any of. So
Yeah, you're not eating of. In the right side of your rib cage, basically where most people think their liver is. If they have problems, if you have pain there, it's usually a gallbladder problem. Not. I mean, the liver is more towards the center.
Right.
Have you noticed that,
And I mean,
Georgie, on Peat forums, people describing that?
I haven't, and I tolerated the fat-free diet for only 2 weeks. I didn't get any of that. I got immense cravings for fat, and that's why I stopped.
And let's
now,
be-
whether you're gonna. Yeah.
Let's be clear, Georgie, if this is correct, right? Peat is not really advocating a low-fat diet. He's only advocating that as a solution, as a short-term intervention for PUFA, right?
And for excess weight, basically. And just as Tucker said, his daughter basically, or the people that go to Japan, they seem to be losing weight on that diet. And I think that's the context in which Peat recommends it.
So Tucker, you don't have a problem with the Peat way of eating as a general way of eating, when it's not used as a dietary intervention in the low-fat form of it, right?
There's a spectrum here, right? If you're talking about orange juice and low-fat milk, that's, for me, like going on a grapefruit diet, right? Or just not eating anything. You might as well just drink water at that point. You're gonna lose weight, but it's not a sustainable, it's not going to be obviously sustainable because you're not getting what you need out of it, right? But as a short-term intervention, sure, just fast. You'll lose all the weight.
You're saying fasting is going to be a more effective and healthier solution for PUFA than low-fat milk and orange juice on a daily basis.
It depends on what your definition of effective is, right? If your only criteria is how fast will you burn fat off, then not eating anything is going to be more effective than eating something.
What would be your criteria for PUFA depletion? How would people know they've So let's say they go into the low carb diet or even fasting, as you mentioned, to get rid of the excess PUFA that they've already stored, especially the person.
By the way, I want to make one thing clear. I'm not a big fan of fasting long term, so I'm not recommending that to anybody.
What's fasting long term for you? 3 days? More than 3 days?
A year.
Okay.
That's a lot. Yes.
I think the record is there was some guy who weighed like 450 pounds and he was on a water fast for a year and he lost all of his excess weight. Yeah. So
how would people know? How would people know? Since we discussed that the meat test is probably not very reliable, because it basically you can trigger it just by basically having very low lipolysis that may trigger meat. How would people know that they've depleted the PUFA?
You mean MEAD, the meat acid that we discussed?
Okay.
Yeah, just I wasn't clear what you were saying.
What would be your test for basically if people have achieved a decent amount of PUFA depletion?
That's a really good question. I mean, the first thing that I noticed was I stopped getting sunburn.
Okay. Yeah, that's the sunburn is the PUFA peroxidation basically under the UV light.
From UV light. Yeah, exactly. And that went away in a matter of weeks. And I've gone back and looked at my calendar, when did I stop and when did I first notice it and when did I really notice it? That's, I think, the first thing that you're going to notice. The second thing that I noticed was my carbohydrate cravings went away. And, I mentioned the endocannabinoid pathway. It makes you crave starch and sweets, right? Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden I lost interest in eating starch and sweets. And I tried a low carb diet before and I had never been able to get over the carbohydrate cravings, right? And this time I just forgot to eat them. So I would say that's another sign that that's immediate because that happens in the gut before they even enter your body.
Right.
And then longer term, you should start losing weight pretty quickly because again, you're not getting the stimulus to overeat and you're losing, the toxins in your body that are causing a Randle cycle dysregulation that's producing and storing too much fat. So
now, Georgie, what about you told me though that when you're losing a lot of this weight on a low carb diet, a lot of that's just water weight going away. It's not
initially, yes.
And then a lot of it's and then a lot of it's muscle waste, eating up your muscle.
Well, but let's talk about that water weight thing, because this is another. I don't know what Georgi's position on this is, but I want to address this because this is a common misunderstanding.
Well, Georgi, what is your position for, just to let him?
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, let me actually rebut what your real position is, not some hypothetical.
Yeah, no.
If you cut carbs, which is what bodybuilders do right before the few days before an actual competition, you will get cut. And the reason is you lose a lot of that water retention. And also, you basically stop producing as much water as a byproduct of carbohydrate metabolism. So that's one of the reasons why they cut the carbs, is because they want to look cut. Now, several people have
agree with that.
Yeah, several people have emailed me and have said that because they're measuring their fat percentage with this electrical impedance device. I don't know how accurate it is, but they're saying that when they went on a low carb diet, their fat percentage didn't change much, while they did lose weight. So their only explanation is they either lost water mostly or maybe muscle mass, right? But if they lost muscle mass, then the percentage of fat should have actually increased, which it didn't. So the only thing that remains is that they may have lost mostly, intracellular, water, basically. Do you think that's correct?
That's absolutely true. I mean, okay. The argument I was going to rebut was this argument that water's stored with glycogen and that you're losing water in glycogen when you go on a low carb diet. That's not correct. For the simple reason that glycogen is not stored in water. That's why you store glycogen, glucose in glycogen, is because it's not in
solution.
In solution, right? It's isolated.
Yeah.
And every freaking doctor out there will tell you that, and it's wrong. And there are experiments showing that it's wrong. But what is correct is that when you eat carbohydrate, your body buffers it starting in your gut by dumping water into your gut. And how do we know this? From some poor guy, David Smith, who went by the name Wolverine on his blog, who had his intestinal tract removed. And he had a bag attached to the bottom of his stomach. He had like 2 inches of small intestine. And one day he decided to drink something with sugar in it, like a Coke or Gatorade. And his body dumped gallons of water into his stomach and out onto the floor to dilute the sugar solution, right? The hypotonic sugar solution. So, and then I found papers that shows that process goes all the way through your body, right? Every time you get this dump of glucose into your serum, your body reacts to it by pumping water into it to dilute it. It's toxic, right? Not surprising. So yeah, that going away is kind of a good thing, because it kind of indicates that this toxin is down to a manageable level and your body doesn't need these gallons of water sloshing around just to dilute the toxic effects of it. So yeah, that's not a bad thing at all. That's a benefit. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that is the first weight that you're going to lose on a low carb diet is from that, your body not having that requirement for that amount of water.
How do you know when you're now burning fat or losing fat versus just water still losing?
Your waist.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, that's one area, another important thing to note, a lot of people get into trouble on a on a low carb diet because they eat a lot of fat, right? And you have to remember something. The storage rate, glucose, when you eat carbs, some of it gets burned off, right? I mean, some of it goes directly into your muscles and gets burned off. Some of it gets burned off because your metabolic rate's turned up. Some of it gets stored. So the storage rate, and then there's this fungibility fact, right? When you eat glucose, there's some fat that doesn't get burned because your body turns off lipolysis and says, whoa, keep the fat in the fat cells, right? Fat storage is 100%, right? When you eat carbohydrates, say maybe 90% of it gets stored either through fat that doesn't get burned or through glycogen or turned into fat. When you eat fat, 100% of it gets stored. There are no waste pathways with fat. Fat's your preferred fuel source, right? So a lot of people get into trouble because they're trying to lose weight and they're eating more fat than they're burning every day. Well, guess what? Its storage rate's 100%. You're not going to lose any fat doing that.
So you recommend a moderate,
Yeah, what should I do? The high protein that you mentioned, basically high protein,
well,
low fat, low carb.
That gets you back to the protein sparing modified fast, right? You want to reduce fuel enough so that you have the opportunity to burn off stored fuel.
So what's a low? So is it moderate fat or low fat that is the key for PUFA healing in your paradigm approach?
I would say moderate fat, right?
So what's that look like a day for people?
Well, that's as much protein as you can eat, basically. I mean, like,
and how much fat, I'm saying, are you eating a day?
Georgi and I both had the same experiment. When we went low fat, we were miserable.
Yeah.
So if
what's
you're
low fat? I know low carb is 20 to 30 carbs or so.
Low fat is nothing but lean meat and vegetables.
But what does that look like on a gram basis? Is that 30? I mean, because is there a key? Is it like 30 grams of fat?
Honestly, I measured my calorie intake for one day. It was the most miserable thing I've ever done, and I've never measured my food intake.
For me, it was a gallon of fat-free milk. So I presumably, of course, zero grams of fat is not completely zero. They round it down, right?
Trace.
But it's probably, if it's a gallon of zero fat milk, and it did look like a fairly transparent, whitish liquid. I would probably say less than 5 grams total per day, because that's the only thing I was consuming. So that got me into a situation where within 2 weeks I craved tremendously fat.
It's an amazing feeling, isn't it? I mean, you literally can't think about anything else when you.
So the fat cravings are stronger on a zero fat diet than the carb cravings are for a zero carb diet. Would you say, both of you?
I would say yes, because I've been on a zero carb diet, and that's tolerable, probably because you can synthesize a decent amount of glucose to the gluconeogenesis to satisfy the cravings. When you're basically like doing zero fat, I guess the pathway to synthesize the fat is not as quick, or at least as efficient as the one to synthesize glucose. So, or maybe our preference, the brain preference for fat is higher, and then that's what got me craving it more.
Well, you have to. I mean, the important thing to understand about gluconeogenesis is it's constant, right? Gluconeogenesis doesn't go down if you eat carbohydrates. It's continuous in your body, so it's not affected by carbohydrate consumption, right? The variation in the rate of glucose that's produced endogenously is how much is released from glycogen, right? So you have a given rate of gluconeogenesis that's happening continuously. You have a release from glycogen that is adjusted according to dietary intake, and then you have whatever your dietary intake is on top of that. So your body's basal glucose need, unless you have, probably liver failure would adjust that. But a healthy person has their glucose needs met constantly, regardless of what they eat. Right. So that's why you can get away with, unless you're eating seed oils that are making you crave carbohydrates, you don't need any carbohydrates in your diet physiologically, because your body is continuously making enough glucose to meet your body's needs for glucose.
So I've got two fusion proposals that kind of fuse Ray Peat bioenergetic paradigm with paleo. One is, what about the Paul Saladino method, where he's eating carnivore meat, he's eating a lot of organs, he's eating muscle meat, I think he's eating some dairy, cheeses, and then he's eating honey, raw honey, and then maybe some fruits.
I think that's great. To me, that sounds great.
It's a protein sparing modified fast. He's just basing it off real foods.
But he probably eats a ribeye. Would that still be low fat?
It's going to be low enough fat so that you're going to be able to burn some body fat. And I would suggest that if you're eating that and you're not losing weight, then you're probably eating too much fat, and you should try and reduce your fat intake.
Are you going to be able to burn fat? Or you should
exercise a little more, and exercise can be just walking. You don't.
But wait a second. I think he's eating honey and stuff on a daily basis, like 100, 200 grams of honey or fruit.
Well, he added that in after a while.
Yeah, because he felt like being in ketosis wasn't healthy for his blood sugar levels, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, again, the Maasai would go for 20 years in Africa. They were not adapted to.
But what I'm saying is like I'm just saying, is that a fusion of the paradigms where you're eating 100, 200 grams of sugar and it's coming, he would say fruit. He would still say avoid starches. Ray Peat's paradigm is a little bit not so excited about starches, except for, I guess, potatoes, right? And some of those. So he's going to avoid grains. You're going to avoid grains. You're going to avoid seed oils, but you're going to eat muscle meat, organ meats, honey, and fruit. Is that a good fusion of the two paradigms?
To me, it sounds like a fusion.
Can you actually burn fat though if you're PUFA damaged and you're going to 100, 200 grams of honey and fruit plus organ meat and muscle meat?
Well, I mean, look, the more insulin you have in your system, the less fat you are going to release from your fat cells.
But I thought, maybe I'm just being ignorant here. I thought when you eat fructose, it doesn't release insulin, Georgie. Isn't that right?
90% of fructose is converted to glucose in the gut. So,
yes, but
you're still going to be releasing some insulin.
Some insulin, but the insulin-genic response to fructose is maybe 1/5 of what it is for glucose. That's why you can give it to diabetic people, and they seem to be doing okay.
Right.
So you could eat. I'm just thinking out loud here. You could eat 100, 200 grams. You're PUFA overweight. You cut out the PUFA. You start eating 100 to 200 grams of fruit juice and honey, plus organ meat and muscle meat. Are you going to be able to lose weight on that?
I think so.
I agree.
So there's a fusion solution. Here's another fusion solution here. Could you cycle in and out, do Ray Peat 1 week and then like a paleo low carb the next week back and forth? Or is that too much? Is that a yo-yo diet that would damage you, you know?
Well, I mean, at that point, that is a Paleolithic diet, right? Because
feast to fast, right?
Yeah. The folks living in Africa ate as much honey as they could get their hands on, right? So that's back in the Paleolithic. That's what they were doing every time. I mean, even today, there are tribes down there who seasonally get 80% of their calories from honey, and they're not obese and they don't have any metabolic problems. So that is a paleo diet. That's about as paleo as you can get. Now, I will say that the folks who eat the Hadza, I think it is, who still eat a lot of honey in their diet, they do have pretty crappy teeth. So you need to be mindful of that aspect of it. But
if you're going 1 week and you're drinking Mexican Coca-Cola a couple of times a week, you're doing your honey, you're drinking your orange juice quarts, you're drinking your milk, you're going the Peat, you're relaxing, and then you go the next week, low carb. Is your body going to be thrown out of whack? Like, holy shnikes, every week it's the stressful stuff. Come on, give me the Coca-Cola.
No, but that's good stress, right? That's the kind of stress you're supposed to be having. That's where you're walking around in your natural environment and you're eating whatever you come upon. You're not going to be finding a bee's nest every week.
Georgie, would you say that stress is overrated as a health benefit?
So I guess the term that people would use would be the hormetic response, right? If basically acute stress and within a certain levels is good for you. I think that is true for younger people. And the biochemical mechanism seems to be when young, healthy people are stressed, they produce cortisol, but they also produce pregnenolone, progesterone, and DHEA, which are mostly produced in the adrenal glands as well. As you age or as you get sicker, stress actually tends to just put you into the cortisol producing state. And you're not, as studies show, that the levels of DHEA and the other youth hormones precipitously drop after the age of about 35. Then I'm not sure how much stress will be stimulating after you've gotten yourself into a health predicament. After a while, as you well know, old people are not very resilient to stress. Even a minor thing can basically put them in a situation where they're shaky for like a day or two and they can't get their act together. So stress really depends on context. If you're young and healthy, stress will probably not be stress, will be a stimulating experience. If you're in your 80s, probably even given a parking ticket will put you in a state where you're angry, shaking, and you cannot sleep.
Right, but we need to be clear about one thing. You're talking about people in the context of an industrial diet, right? A lot of those things only happen in that context, right? Hunter-gatherers don't decline in the same way that people on an industrial diet do. Now, so that gets us to the next question. How fast can you get back to healthy if you're in an industrial diet context? My father, in the last couple of years of his life, had been under medical care for decades and had all sorts of issues. For instance, I was talking to him on the phone at one point, and he mentioned that he thought he was going to have gallbladder surgery because he was having gallbladder pain. And the next time so I went by his house and I looked in the fridge and he had nothing in there but low-fat milk. And I said, I said, why are you eating this? And he said, oh, well, the doctor said I should be eating a low-fat diet. And I was like, well, that's why you're having gallbladder pain, Dad. Start buying full-fat milk again. And he never mentioned his gallbladder again, right, for the remaining few years of his life. When I wound up cooking for him and putting him on my diet, what I eat. And oh my God, the meeting I had with the doctor was just unbelievable. And, the doctor disclosed that my father had HbA1c of 6.4 for years, and he'd never told him, because 6.4 is not considered diabetic. 6.5 is considered diabetic. Now, my father at this point was facing a foot amputation because of the diabetic side effects, even though he was only pre-diabetic, right?
Right.
And, I said, why didn't you tell him? And he said, well, we don't have any way to treat diabetes at that level. That's considered normal. And he was like, well, what do you do? And my answer was diabetes. Diabetes is easy, doc. I'll take care of the diabetes. 2 months, come back, A1C 5.6. My dad lost 50 pounds in like 3 months in his 80s and started feeling great. Didn't reverse all of his health problems. And he wound up, dying a couple of years later, partly because of his years of medical care, massive calcification all through his body. But from statins.
Yep. That will do it.
From warfarin, right? Both cause calcification. None of his doctors knew that statins and warfarin cause calcification. And here's a guy who's facing having his foot cut off because of calcification. Just unbelievable. But, he said he was feeling great. He felt a lot better. And we were able to get him off most of his drugs, and all of that made him feel even better, So, so he wound up dying at 87 when he decided he wanted to go back on the junk food diet. And at that point, he declined precipitously. So, a lot of this depends. We don't know the answer, how much of this damage can be healed. I think a lot of it can. I don't know that all of it can. I mean, the lipofuscin that Georgi mentioned earlier, there's a lot of protein damage in the body that's caused by polyunsaturated fat consumption. In the literature, a lot of it's termed irreversible, right? Lipofuscin is fuscin, whatever you say, is one of those things. That's what causes age spots. When my wife fixed her diet, her age spot on her hand got significantly better, not totally gone. So it remains something we have to learn, how much of this damage can be reversed and at what age can it be reversed, So I wouldn't say just because somebody who's on a SAD diet immediately feels miserable when they have carbohydrates that, if you're doing this in a healthy way, that you're not going to be able to get through that and start feeling a lot better.
So, Georgi, do you recommend? Do you still think that the best optimal approach? I mean, I know you've dealt with a lot of folks at the Ray Peat forums and other communities that you interact with that have seen huge benefit from doing this bioenergetic way of living. Do you still think that is the best? I mean, we've just had this conversation here. Is that the best thing you would still recommend for folks to do if they're dealing with PUFA damage and overweight or obesity issues?
Yeah, getting rid of the PUFA stores is paramount. I guess the only place where we kind of digress with Tucker here is that I'm cognizant of the studies that show that that actually PUFA appears to be preferentially stored while saturated fats preferentially oxidized while you're eating them. Conversely, when you're actually you've seen the opposite, right? Or
Stephen Kinane did a lot of work on that back in the 90s, I think, where he showed high oxidation rates for PUFAs on consumption. And the question was, if this is so essential, why are we getting rid of it so fast?
Exactly. So it really depends which one is true. Yeah.
To your point, most
of us
for the audience sake, we can't get rid of it all. And
for the audience sake, how is that study the big differentiating point for these two different approaches?
Well, that's one reason why Peat is cognizant, or at least cautious, of increasing lipolysis by, let's say, like cutting carbs or going on a sort of like a more strenuous exercise. He's saying PUFA is dangerous, but it's even more dangerous when it's floating around in the bloodstream beyond certain amounts. And he quotes several studies that are older, but now I found newer ones with humans showing that the organ damage in type 2 diabetes is primarily caused by circulating PUFA, specifically the kidney failure, the liver failure that they're getting, and even some of the cardiovascular abnormalities that lead to the gangrenous limbs that eventually have to be amputated and things like that. So he's saying,
all of which I completely agree with.
Yeah, based on these studies and whether that's true or not, I guess it still remains an open question. Is PUFA preferentially oxidized or stored when eaten? And then when it's lipolyzed, is it PUFA preferentially released then? Because if that's the case, that's where Pete, I think, is coming from, saying PUFA is dangerous when it's in the bloodstream because it's touching every organ, right? Once it's stored, which is not great because you've already eaten it, but now it's stored in the tissues. And his thing is increase the metabolic rate by T3, and then of course stop eating PUFA, that dietary one, as much as possible, and then basically burn it off, but by raising the metabolic rate. That's probably the only digression that we're having here. Right. Diverging views on that one.
And Tucker, you're saying that those studies that Ray Peat is referring to are inaccurate, or where's the rub there?
Well, I think the difference here is that even when it's stored, it's still doing damage, right?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, in adipose tissue, PUFA is breaking down and causing, all the hallmarks of what's going on wrong in adipose tissue: the inflammation, the macrophage attack, the autoimmune reaction against adipose tissue, the hyperplasia where it can't divide, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the insulin resistance, the excess lipolysis. All of that's caused by stored PUFA in the adipose tissue. So I think you want to get it out of there as fast as possible to stop that damage, right? Yeah. And I think if you're distributing it out to the rest of the body, essentially it's okay. So you're still on this diet that you've been on for the last few decades for another 6 months effectively, or whatever, as your adipose tissue is releasing it. Now you have to remember, adipose tissue, when it releases it, is going to release, half of it this year, and then half of what's left the next year, So you are going to be on a slowly declining diet of PUFA, if you want to look at it that way, even though it's coming out of adipose tissue instead of coming into your mouth.
Yeah, I think that's the only digression. Pete is saying, yes, definitely get rid of PUFA, but if you do it fast, you can do more damage because of that circulating PUFA. So it's better to support the liver, support the kidneys, raise the metabolic rate, and then, because there's always some level of baseline lipolysis, we always have free fatty acids at some level circulating in the bloodstream. So he's saying, over time, if you eliminate the dietary PUFA completely, over time, because of the turnover and the baseline lipolysis, the body will get rid of the PUFA in the stores, and then the liver will take care of the rest of it. So he's
essentially advocating a slower reduction in
precisely
PUFA. I mean, that's a reasonable approach to take.
And he's saying the slower reduction will result in urinating the PUFA out, not burning it out.
So, some of it will be burned. You cannot completely urinate it, but most of it will get processed by the liver, and then you will basically pee it out as these.
And how long does this process go? Months or a year or 2 years?
Well, it depends on a couple of things. How fast is your metabolic rate, because you'll oxidize some of it, right? How well is your liver functioning? Now, 70% of people, I'm sorry, 60-some percent.
PUFA causes liver failure. That's a big question.
That's a big question. So apparently 60% of Americans have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. That's huge. Right. So basically means your liver will be impaired to start with. Now you can support the liver. And I think that's what the orange juice with all of its flavonoids comes in. He's said several times, quoting studies, that the flavonoids in orange juice, whether you take them from orange juice or somewhere else, help the liver heal, right? Gelatin lowers the inflammation for the liver as well. So it really comes down to how quick versus how slow. And he's coming from a background where I think he almost got himself diabetic, and his dad got himself diabetic apparently by doing both extreme fasting and hard physical labor. And he's saying his dad cured himself by eating brewer's yeast, which contains a lot of B vitamins, and basically avoiding this overexertion that caused the diabetes. So maybe that he's biased in that respect. But to his credit, his point, most elite athletes, especially bodybuilders, do not diet. If they gain weight, they lose it through steroid abuse, use, right?
Georgi, that's just wrong.
I'm not saying that
What's
they're
wrong?
doing the right thing. I'm saying that they prefer the
most elite
steroid approach
athletes
because
do not diet is just flat wrong. And I know a
oh,
lot
you don't
of,
think that's true?
I know personally world record winning athletes, and they absolutely do diet, no question.
What diets do they follow?
Well, they, depends who they're talking to, but I
Ray
mean,
Peat diet?
I don't know about any. I don't know. I mean, most athletes talk to a dietitian, so they're following some version of the standard American, the dietary guidelines diet. And I've talked to those athletes. I've talked to the dietitians online. I've talked to, Zach Bitter. I've been on his podcast a couple of times and talked to him about it. He's got the world record at the moment for the 100-mile run on track and on trail. He's a low carb guy, but to our discussion, he is intermittent carb consumption when he needs extra output, right? So he's not ketogenic, he's ketogenic for recovery, and then he increases carb consumption when he needs basically more octane. So yeah, they I mean, Joe Friel, who is the US triathlete coach for years, wrote literally the book on diet and training for triathletes. He had a diet that he recommended. He went on a low carb diet and found that it was better for him. Phil Maffetone, who I know personally, had diet recommendations for triathletes. He was triathlete coach of the world, and three of the greatest triathletes in history followed his diet approach, right? So,
small correction on my part. By
That's-
that, I meant excessive fasting. So that's not necessarily that they wouldn't change their diets. Is that they
excessive
if they
fasting?
gave,
Yes,
yeah,
yes, yeah. No, they don't want to fast because then you
Yeah.
lose muscle mass.
Yeah,
and that slows you down.
So, Georgi, are you concerned that people who do a low carb approach, moderate fat, that they're going to have problems with potentially diabetes down the road to solve their PUFA problem that way?
Even before the diabetes, my concern is that basically if they fast or go on a low carb diet for too long, just as Tucker said, they will probably have lower production of thyroid hormone. Whether that's optimal or not, I think is still open for discussion. And then if they have a lower basal metabolic rate, and also potentially, now whether that's true or not, again, we can probably still argue, if you have a lower carb diet and if you have increased gluconeogenesis because of the lower carb diet, would you lose more muscle mass? And if muscles are the primary determinant, they're the metabolically active tissue. Fatty tissue mostly prefers to store more fat, right? It's the muscles that burn most of the calories that you're consuming together with your brain and maybe your liver. So, but it's really the lean muscle mass, and that's why a lot of people try to maximize it, which determines basically how lean and muscular and strong you will be. I
agree with that, because if you're on a complete ketogenic diet and you're exceeding your carbohydrate requirement because of your activities, right? You are going to produce cortisol to tell your muscles to break down to produce sugar for your body. That's without question a physiological process. That's the expected physiological process. So would it make sense to eat, as Paul Jaminet recommended years ago, that you want to eat enough carbohydrates so that you never need to break down muscle? I think there may be some benefit to periodically breaking down muscle. I mean, just because
turnover, right?
There's a natural amount of turnover that goes on anyway, unless you're fasting. So, that's a reasonable position to take. That's kind of what Zach Bitter does is, if you're an athlete, you work hard for your muscle mass. You don't want to break it down. So
if I got this right, I guess Georgi's take-home advice for someone who's overweight or PUFA damaged for years and they're ready to get clean and get going, and the dietary level, I know there's other factors involved, but you would say, Georgi, you do fat-free, and then you do low fat or moderate fat, moderate protein, high sugar, and then Tucker,
I wouldn't do fat-free. I tried it myself.
Even as a transition. Even
1% fat is better than no fat. I mean, at least that's how it worked for me and other people.
In terms of health or just comfort or what?
Actually, even weight loss, because if you detest the food that you're eating,
Yes.
you will not be very good at basically. I mean, it's just that it will put you in a mental state where you'll be producing actually a lot of stress hormones, which increase the further storage of fat. Cortisol, if it's chronically upregulated because you're hating your food and you basically don't feel well about one of the primary things that are part of your life, you're probably not going to be sticking to the diet very well and just doing well on a mental level. So 1% fat is doable to me and many other people, and probably even 2% fat milks. I'm just basing off the milk if you have to eat milk. That's probably still okay. In general, fats that are over 25% calories as fat are considered, unless you also exercise and doing other things, are considered mildly obesogenic. Now, whether that's true for everybody, I don't know. But anything over 25% in the literature, they call it a elevated fat diet. I don't know if Tucker agrees with that or not.
We're talking again about a literature that's including a certain amount of omega-6 fats universally.
Exactly. So if the PUFA is 0, then it can probably get to a much higher percentage of fat because they first of all, they're pro-metabolic. Second, they're not anti-metabolic. They get oxidized more easily, especially the shorter chain fatty acids such as coconut oil. They get oxidized very similarly to glucose. They don't need a special transport into the mitochondria. So if you can eat, whatever diet you want, but supplement with a spoon or two of coconut oil daily, that's probably a good approach.
MCT oil.
Folks. No, not MCT.
Coconut oil.
Exactly, coconut oil. Yeah. The MCT oil is just another waste. It's not a completely waste product the way fish oil is because it's not rancid and oxidized, but it's still not the same benefits as the full spectrum fatty acids in
it tends to make people sick. And
and coconut oil has 3% PUFA in it, though, right?
No, typically less than that.
Yeah, it should be hard at room temperature, and that's usually how we know it's fairly high percentage of saturated fats. It should be the ones that I've seen.
Should be rock hard. Well, rock hard where you live, of course, but it should be.
What about refined coconut oil that stays liquid at room temperature?
I don't think that has to do with the refinement. It's more along the lines of the fatty acid composition. I think the coconut oil should be hard.
Yeah, the melting point of coconut oil, I think, is like 76 or 78 degrees. Yeah. So if you live in Florida, it may be liquid, but it's, if you stick it in the fridge, it should be like, wax. It should be solid, rock hard.
I go to the local Whole Foods here in DC, and you can tell the good quality coconut oils because even in the jar, they're hard. And when you shake the jar, there's no movement inside. And then there's right next to them, I'm not going to mention the brands, but there's something that's maybe have a little bit of solid, like half the jar is solid, but the other half is liquid. And some of them are fully liquid. And those, I mean, because I've opened those liquid oils, it's MCT. They're selling it MCT as basically coconut oil.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're supposed to say, sometimes they do these marketing terms. They say fractionated coconut oil, which is another name for the MCT, right? Because they've extracted only some of the fats, right? But now the pandemic apparently removed a lot of the requirements for labeling. So they can sell you pure MCT and still call it coconut oil as long as it was derived from coconut oil.
Yeah.
So yeah, solid. It should be solid at room temperature. And I think that's saturated enough to give you a good pro-metabolic benefit. So yeah, I wouldn't go zero fat. It just does not work.
So both agree that zero fat's out of the picture, and you would say, Tucker, that zero carb is probably best out of the picture as well. Would you say?
I mean, again, it's an intervention, and it is going to, I mean, we have, look, to Georgi's point about getting rid of PUFA through the liver, we have, there's, what's his name, Ludwig, who rails against fructose. I've seen studies that show a harm from fructose consumption in humans, in human children. Except the markers that they're using are oxidized PUFA, right? Yeah. So fructose, for whatever reason, causes ox-LDL to go up because it oxidizes the PUFA that's in the liver and it gets sent out into as, oxidized LDL. And it increases the production of HNE, the main toxin that we're talking about here, in the liver. So yes, consuming sugar will cause PUFA to break down faster, but it is breaking it down into toxins, which the body is then excreting through the urine. And we could argue about, is that the most optimal way to do it? Yeah. Clearly we have a difference of opinion here. I think either approach, at that point, you're like, okay, we both abandoned the Titanic, is it best to have 3 oars or, is it best to have 4 oars or 6 oars in your rowboat? I think we're way off on the same page at that point. We're just discussing the best tactics at that.
Try either one. I don't see a problem with trying either approach and see which one leads you to both.
And bigger... what's your approach, Tucker? You think it's how many carbs or how many, because you're not.
I would, I would go, ketogenic short term. I agree about reducing.
What short term? 6 months max? 3 months max?
Maybe a couple of years. I mean, in my case, it took me 4 years for my liver enzymes to normalize. So it took 4 years for the most obvious symptom of fatty liver disease to go away.
So maybe that study that Peat is quoting, that the 4 years of tissue turnover, maybe it's about right.
Oh, I think it is about right. And I've come up with the same number. I mean, if you just look at, if you do the half rate calculation, it comes out to 4 or 5 years to get down to something in the low single digits. So yeah, I totally agree with that. And
so you wouldn't be eating fruit for 2 years or so. I
ate some fruit. It wasn't like I was,
but you weren't eating you weren't drinking a couple glasses of orange juice a day.
I stopped.
You would eat low carb raspberries.
I stopped orange
or something.
Juice. I would have orange juice maybe once every couple of months when I went out for breakfast.
It just blows my mind how
I would eat apples.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think people don't understand, and I've seen lots of bad advice around this, is, and I in fact heard it just the other day, is from a physician who said, oh, you don't want to go on a keto diet because then if you have a little bit of sugar, you're going to be knocked out of ketosis for weeks. And that's BS, right? Your body, once you get over your body will very quickly get to a point where it can switch back and forth between sugar and ketones, in a couple of weeks at the latest. So it's not like, if you're on a ketogenic diet, it's not like sugar becomes a poison, right? If you want to have an apple, have an apple. If you want to have an orange, have an orange. I would avoid the apple juice. I would avoid the orange juice, right? Get it in a natural form where it's going to be titrated into your body more slowly because it's coming in with fiber and lots of other stuff that is going to slow down your digestion, right?
So
I think
it's
that's
interesting
a reasonable
how
thing to do. I don't believe, I mean, with the exception maybe of people who have epilepsy, I don't believe that there's any benefit for pursuing high ketone levels. I don't believe there's any benefit for being, rabid about avoiding carbohydrates. I didn't do that. I got all the benefits from, with having fruit occasionally and,
you just didn't crave
ice cream once in a while.
Yeah. You just didn't crave carbs.
Yeah, I didn't crave carbs,
It's interesting how both of
having ice cream at the end of my meal. And my wife, my ex-wife, my wife at the time, who was getting advice from a dietitian, had this dietitian tell her all sorts of BS stuff. Yeah. But she also gave her a ketone stick. So she told her, oh, alcohol is going to knock you out of ketogenesis and you'll be out of ketogenesis for weeks. And I was like, fine, try it. Drink the glass of wine. We'll take your ketones in the morning. And in the morning, it was deep blue. So she was, the dietitian was wrong. And your metabolism, even for someone who was unhealthy like my ex-wife, is a lot more flexible than some people will tell you it is. So you don't need to be manic about carbohydrate avoidance.
But it's interesting how both paradigms are very close in different ways. Both paradigms are saying PUFA is the big problem. And then both paradigms are saying, cheeses are good, saturated fat is good, coconut oil is good, meat is good, liver is good, shellfish is good, even fruits and so forth. But the solution for how to deal with the original PUFA problem is still miles apart, almost in some sense. It feels like that. It seems like that.
Why do you think it's miles apart?
Because you're saying don't touch orange juice for 2 years, and he's saying you've got to drink orange juice to get going from the PUFA toxicity immediately. You know what I mean? That's a big difference. Low carb eating broccoli and raspberries with chicken and beef is wildly different from drinking lots of milk and orange juice with your beef. You know what I'm saying? It's a big difference.
it's definitely a difference. I don't know how big of a difference it is at the end of the day.
I think it comes down to whether these studies that we've seen, how dangerous is PUFA stored versus how dangerous is PUFA released, and which one gets you. Because obviously, if you already have PUFA stored, you're in a bad shape, right? So the question is, how do I get rid of it? Do I get rid of it fast? Do I basically clench my teeth and I get rid of it fast, maybe over a couple of months by essentially stimulating its release, whether it's through cutting carbs and or doing exercise and doing other things, maybe sauna or whatnot, right? Or if you know, again, depending on whether how dangerous PUFA is in the bloodstream, then maybe, which is what Pete is saying, then maybe it's like, oh, you know what, you don't want it prolonged, maybe like acute, maybe you go for a run, but then after you go back, maybe you have like that ice cream to kind of calm the system down and basically like do a little bit of restoration, because ice cream will be mostly saturated fat, right? So there are many ways to skin the cat.
Ice cream is the common bond that will heal the nation of obesity. That's what we've decided.
Well,
the comfort food.
Yeah. That's the uniting force for all health issues is the ice cream diet. That's
exactly. And, you know, I mean, look, you know, Georgi and I Ray Peat agree. I wouldn't even say 80%. It's probably 90%, right? The materials stuff we agree on. We're literally talking about how are we going to be rowing away from the sinking ship that we both agree we need to leave as fast as possible, right?
But drinking a Mexican Coke, Mexican Coke is a big difference from a low carb paradigm from the average person's perspective. That's huge.
Depends how many of them you're drinking. I mean, you know,
he's saying
tried a Mexican Coke. You know, honestly though, you know, my daughter said to me one day after, you know, because we switched the whole family onto this protocol once we realized how beneficial it was. And she looked at me and she said, Daddy, the thing I hate about your diet is that now everything tastes too sweet to me, right? And that's kind of a good thing, because all of a sudden you're like, you know, if I had
you're sensitive to sugar.
Yeah, if I had a Mexican Coke, I mean, I'll have a rum and Coke once in a while, and I'm just like, oof, this is too sweet, you know, and I don't have the taste for it anymore. But
George, you don't have that problem, do you?
Afraid of it.
You don't have that problem of things being too sweet for you, right?
You know what? It may be a bit of an adaptation too. I don't have it anymore. After being on a low carb diet back in 2009, 2011 timeframe, when I stopped that after finding Peat, things did taste a bit too sweet. And after a while, staying in basically like after the introducing of the sugar, then that, I guess the taste buds got blunted or something. I don't feel that way anymore when I drink the Mexican Coke, that I'm drinking something too sweet. If I eat Nutella, which I avoid because it's mostly like hazelnut oils and whatnot, then I don't know what they do with it. Maybe it's the seed oils that actually somehow amplify this rush, right? To me, even a tiny spoon of Nutella is just too much. I feel like I'm about to puke. It's just causing nausea. But drinking a Mexican Coke or the orange juice, not so much. But of course, it's not indirectly comparable. Orange juice has like the citric acid, makes it like, you know, a little bit sour, like gives it a tangy taste, right? It's got the flavonoids. So it's a difference. But I think the only difference here is basically how long can you go until you get rid of PUFA, and can we get a reliable biomarker on that? Basically, you've gotten to the point where, and with that, you know, chasing PUFA is not that.
With that known, it's 2024, and the new president is saying, I've realized PUFA is the problem. I've seen this podcast, and I'm bringing Tucker and Georgie together because I'm not sure about the final solution for dealing with this obesity problem in America. I've created a task force. We're going to solve the obesity problem. We're going to rewrite the food pyramid, and it starts with Georgie and Tucker coming together and trying to hash out what we know with the available data to get people off ramp of obesity. What do you tell the president? How do you guys work out the gaps of knowledge? Is there further studies that need to be done to figure out that little issue that you guys were describing about the PUFA and its toxicity in the blood? What do you tell the president with the gaps you have, but also the commonality? He obviously agrees with you guys that PUFA is the problem, and he says, guys, let's get it done. This is a huge problem. What do you tell him?
Well, if no matter which approach you follow, get PUFA out of the food supply. Basically, you gotta go back to using oils that are, you know, if the simplest thing is, if you can tomorrow convert all processed food to be using butter or whatever is easier to find, whatever more saturated fat is easier to find, that alone will have a tremendous impact, even if the dietary patterns of the Americans do not change. If you can get rid of the PUFA as a dietary supply, that to me would cover 80% of the situation, of the problems. And over time, the other 20% will basically naturally occur, as even if it's slower than 4 years. If you're only eating mostly saturated fat, I think over time, basically, like the PUFA problem will decline, even if you don't go on a diet that tries to get rid of it faster than what the turnover would normally be.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think you need to worry about, I mean, optimizing it is nice for nerds like us, but you don't need to worry about optimizing it to fix health and for the whole country. I wouldn't even, I mean, yes, look, sugar has a problem. Sugar leads to cavities. So that's.
But Georgie, practically speaking for a second, do you think the average American, once they get the PUFA pill, are they going, they take the PUFA pill, the red pill about PUFA, are they going to be able to follow a low carb diet to get off of that obesity problem, or are they going to be able to follow the Peat principles more effectively, like realistically, in your opinion?
No, the Peat principles will probably be easier simply because sugar is so ubiquitous, at least in the form of this high fructose corn syrup. It's everywhere, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of which one they will be able to follow more easily, like naturally, is in terms of like what they would like more. I would say initially, probably people will probably be drawn to the higher fat, low carb diet because we have more sensitive taste buds for fat. Evolutionarily, we tend to go for higher fat, higher caloric density foods. And since fat has the highest numbers of calories per gram, 9 grams versus 4 for carbs, people may reach for the fattier food more. For example, people will go for ice cream over Mexican Coke 9 times out of 10. People would go for a fatty steak over lean chicken, purely based on taste, 9 times out of 10. And so it will come down to basically what is easier for people to follow. And I'm okay with Tucker's approach as long as we completely cut out PUFA from incoming into the food supply. Because if people are consuming mostly saturated fat, even if they go on the low carb diet where they're actually increasing lipolysis, and I've actually asked Pete directly about it. I said, what happens if somebody feels better on a low carb diet, wants to lose weight more quickly? What can they do to limit the damage of PUFA, assuming floating PUFA in the bloodstream will cause organ damage? He said, eat a spoon of coconut oil at least 3 times a day.
Okay, that's an interesting idea. Yeah, I mean, from the context of trying to slow down PUFA release from the adipocytes, that would be effective. But yeah,
how is spooning in coconut oil a day help the PUFA get out? Like you just said,
it's gonna raise. I mean, fatty acid are released from adipocytes based on the fatty acid already present in the bloodstream, right? Just like glucose is released from the liver based on glucose in the bloodstream. So if you're taking it supplementally, your body is going to regulate release from storage.
And also, the more saturated fat as a ratio you have over PUFA in the bloodstream, Pete is saying that will limit the pro-inflammatory damaging effects of PUFA that will have on the organs when it's circulating in the bloodstream. And also, the more saturated fat you have around the PUFA, the more resistant the PUFA is to the breakdown, the oxidative breakdown that creates these toxic aldehydes, malondialdehyde, and many of the others that Tucker mentioned. So it's almost like having vitamin E, assuming vitamin E is an antioxidant, basically. But Pete is saying if you don't want to take any supplements and you will be in a state of high lipolysis, high stress, whether that's exercise, fasting, whatever you want to call it, he's saying just make sure you have some saturated fat into the system to buffer the effects of PUFA floating around in the bloodstream.
That's an interesting perspective. I mean, that does make a certain amount of sense because you're going to separate. I mean, I presume you're going to be diluting the PUFA, and when PUFA breaks down, the toxins that it breaks down into can then cause other PUFA to break down. So if it's separated by something else, the next thing it hits won't be another PUFA molecule. Yeah, I mean, that certainly makes sense. Absolutely.
And Georgie, if you're doing a low calorie, Peat, low fat approach to the PUFA problem, it is going to be a stressful condition for the body, right? It's going to hurt short term, right?
More stressful than eating the carbs, but if I'm on a low carb diet, I would not go for exhaustive runs or like things that would increase the lipolysis even more. I think that diet is good enough. And I think you'll be losing weight on that diet. I've experienced myself when I was low carbing. My mistake was that the doctor said, you need to run 6 miles a day, at least 5 days a week. And that did me in.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. I mean, I think you can train up to doing it, but, you know, in talking to actually my doctor here in town, my new doctor who follows this sort of diet, he was a big runner, and he was already a big runner. And when he fixed his diet, it took him weeks and weeks of being tired and exhausted before he was able to get back up to his previous level of activity, right? Now, he was a boxer, so he was used to getting hit in the head. So he was willing to put up with a little more pain and suffering than the average person would. But I would hate to see somebody, you know, try and run 6 miles when they're in the middle of the Atkins flu and drop the whole approach, because that's miserable, because it will be miserable. I mean, I think exercise is really important. There are lots of benefits beyond the context of this discussion for exercise. And I think typically what happens with people is as they start feeling better, they feel like they can go out and do a walk. And even if that's all you're doing, you're going to be better off than not doing it. So
Definitely.
do the level of exercise that you can do and that you feel comfortable doing.
So Tucker, since you seemingly have really reduced a lot of the PUFA in your life and you're thriving on a paleo low carb diet, what's the harm in you now taking the Peat pill and going full Peat, just to see what would that do to your lifestyle if you incorporated the orange juice, the milk more often, the Coke, you know, some of those highlights, more sugar, ice cream, more regular. I know you eat Haagen-Dazs sometimes, but like, what if you just kind of leaned into that level? What would that do? What would be the harm in doing that for you where you're at, since you've already seemingly solved the PUFA problem for you for some years now?
I've tried it and I just feel worse when I do that. So, you know,
you're high fructose, you're not saying high starch, you're saying high fructose.
I mean, you know, occasionally once in a while, I'll like decide to go, usually when I'm traveling, I'll decide to binge on a bunch of candy bars and I feel like crap afterwards.
Yeah, but that's got PUFA in it probably.
Not really. Not if, I mean, you know, it depends. Like I've discovered recently that peanut M&Ms, my longtime favorite candy, are now made with high oleic peanuts. So that's back on the menu. But even with ice cream, if I eat too much sugar, I just feel crappy. So I don't.
Georgie, if you're stuck in a gas station and you have to eat healthy and chips, would you eat the avocado oil fried potato chip or the coconut oil fried bugle corn chip?
Oh, the latter, because it's mostly saturated fat. But the avocado oil is, depending on the variety, they're trying to push it as a high oleic type of oil, which seems to be the case for the organically grown, naturally growing avocado trees. But the ones that are in the farms, mostly in Southern California, I was reading a paper recently saying that their fatty acid composition approach is that of sunflower oil. So, you know, just because it's avocado oil, there's a big difference in fatty acid composition between the different varieties of trees and depending on where they're growing. So if I had the choice between the two,
even within a single orchard, you can have a huge variation in the fatty acid content of the avocado, like if it's on the sunny side of the hill or the shady side of the hill, apparently. So
So Georgie, if you can wave a magic wand and replace all potato chip brands for the health of the Americans with coconut oil or beef tallow, which would you prefer for the health?
The latter, because the coconut oil has a lower smoke point temperature. So when you're actually frying things in coconut oil, it tends to generate a lot of smoke, which it's a breakdown also product of some of the fatty acids. And that generates some oxidized products, even from saturated fat, which are less than ideal. Beef tallow is probably ideal for frying food because it's basically the mostly saturated equivalent of the canola oil that I'm currently using, which is mostly PUFA, while the beef tallow has the mostly stearic acid, which is the 18 carbon long saturated fatty acid, which is the saturated analog of the 18 carbon omega-6 fatty acid, linoleic and linolenic, right, which are mostly found in the canola oil. So beef tallow, top choice. Butter would be second top choice. Coconut oil, third choice. Avocado oil, fourth choice. and then all the PUFA oils, which I will try not to touch if possible.
I have a dream of seeing in
They make
America.
good biodiesel, right, Georgi?
Yeah.
They're what?
The PUFAs make good biodiesel.
Good, great biodiesel, great varnish. Like if you're into like carpentry and things like that.
I totally agree with your fat hierarchy there. I mean, people are surprised to hear that actually the most toxic oil for repeated frying is coconut oil. Yeah. It's fine if you use it once, but if you're gonna get into like mass production of,
it's a single usage oil. It's a single usage oil, so you better throw it out afterwards.
Yeah.
I have a dream of seeing in America that can eat pints of full fat ice cream and beef tallow fried potato chips every day and be lean and healthy and vibrant. I think we can
look at the ads from the 1950s. They're all lean people.
Exactly. That was the 1950s.
Yeah. Well, very good. Back to the future we go, right? I appreciate your time, guys. Where can people follow Georgi and Tucker? Georgi, start with you.
I have a blog, but since I mentioned before we started recording, I post online under the alias Haidut, HAI as in dog, U as in Tom, .me. Haidut.me is my blog. And also post on the Peat forum, basically a copycat of the articles from my blog post, but I interact with people more on the forum. It's Peat, one word, Peat forum, one word.com. And then I also have a Twitter account, which is just mostly articles that I post, but it's twitter.com/Haidut, the same as the blog moniker.
Thank you. Tucker?
And I am at yelling-stop.blogspot.com. I'm very active at Twitter under Tucker Goodrich, and you can find me at YouTube under Tucker Goodrich, where I've got a podcast thing going, which has kind of got some neat stuff on it. And I just want to, Georgi, great conversation. I'm really glad we did this. David, thank you for making it happen. I think I've learned a lot about the Peat perspective and the things that I agree with and I disagree with. And it's, great to see that it's mostly the former rather than the latter.
United we stand against the evil of PUFA.
Exactly.
Very good. I appreciate you guys. Thank you. This has been very helpful, and I think this will be very important for folks who are in the disparate fields of interest, paleo, keto, Peat world, to be able to see these ideas interact together. I don't see this often online in a productive way, so it's good to see it. So thank you for doing that. Take care.
Thanks for inviting us.